participants that we will have multiple language translation during the course of this meeting today. You can select your preferred language, either English or Spanish, by going down in the Zoom application. This is only on the web-based application. This is unfortunately not available for those that are calling in. If you go onto the far right, there is a button labeled interpretation, and then you need to select your preferred language, either English or Spanish. Even if you can hear me now, you will have difficulty if you do not select one language. So please go ahead and do that so you can fully participate in the meeting. I will also do a roll call for identification purposes for all of our members. Board Member Broad?
Here.
Board Member Flores?
Present.
Board Member Hall?
Present.
And Board Member Lightstone?
Present.
And again, my name is Victoria Hasid. Also present from our staff today are our Executive Secretary, Santiago Avila Gomez, and the Assistant to the Chair, Ed Haas, who are providing technical support. As we all know, we are still living in a rapidly changing time and during the pandemic, and the board is committed to taking the steps necessary to protect the health of our staff as well as members of the public. To that end, in accordance with Executive Order N2920, today's meeting is being held via virtual teleconference with an option for members of the public to dial in or join via web. As reflected on the agenda, today's meeting consists of two main parts. First, we'll have our regular open session business, and we'll hear several items and reports from members of the board and staff. We'll also have an informational panel where we'll learn from experts about California's indigenous farm worker population and how we as the ALRB can improve the way that we serve this critical population. At the close of the business portion of the meeting, we will open the meeting up for public comment on any portion of the meeting. Members of the public who have contacted the board either by email or phone and asked to be placed in the public comment queue will be called on in order received. If you do not previously contact the board and you do wish to comment, you may still do so. And we ask that you let us know in several ways. You can either let us know in the chat feature, which is also at the bottom of your screen in chat. If you click the participant panel, you can also raise your hand and using that feature to be placed in the queue for public comment. If for any reason you're having any technical difficulties, please email Mr. Santiago Avila Gomez. His email is available on the meeting agenda, which is up on our website at alrb.ca.gov. We'll take public comments in sign-up order and then open it up for all of those who are joining later in the queue. We do have limited capabilities for managing participation during the meeting and during the public comment period. So we're asking that everyone who is not speaking to place their phones or Zoom on mute and wait to unmute until you are called to speak. You can also see these instructions on the agenda again, which is posted online at alrb.ca.gov and is on our homepage under the news and information section. With that, we'll commence our open session. Our first agenda item is approval of the public meeting minutes from our last public meeting on August 11th, 2020. May I have a motion from one of our board members to approve the public meeting minutes?
So moved. Second.
Oh, right. I believe I have a motion. I think I heard from Senator Hall first, and then Member Broad, can I have a second? Barry, do you second that motion?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Great. And next we'll move on to the chair's report. We'll have a fairly short report today. I'd like to provide an update on several items. First, I would like to provide an update to something that I first raised at our June 23rd meeting, which was a few weeks after the tragic murder of George Floyd. In light of that event, as well as a general understanding by the executive team, the general counsel and I wanted to make a public commitment that we were taking several steps to ensure that we had a collaborative, diverse, and welcoming workplace culture at the ALRB, both internally for the benefit of all of our staff and board members, and that would help better inform our work so that we can improve the way that we serve the public, given the populations that we serve in our mission. To that end, we wanted to have the entire staff at ALRB go through a implicit bias and unconscious bias training as one piece of that work in order to effectuate those principles and develop those skills as a team and improve the workplace. I committed at that time to provide an update, and I'm happy to say that we have contracted with the vendor and that we will be having that full staff training in early November. It will be a 2-day, 3-hour training, and we're very much looking forward to it and think that that is one of many steps that we're going to take. I think that also ties in well with the theme of our panel today, which is how we can better serve our Indigenous farm worker population and develop a higher level of cultural competency so that we're more effective in our work. Next, I would like to update the board. We were very pleased to participate in a recent event, California OES, the Listos program, and with the United Way of Fresno Madera, co-hosted an emergency preparedness and COVID-19 farm worker resources fair. This event was held in Mendota at Stemolos Produce last Friday, and both board member Flores and I, as well as the general counsel, Julie Montgomery and Leila Shaver, participated. And it was a great event. It was a socially distanced community resource fair, as well as a drive-through resource fair where estimated 3,000 to 5,000 farm workers, both from Stemolos Produce as well as the larger community, were invited to drive through, get information about what to do to better prepare themselves for disasters, resources available to them in their community from social services, labor rights with ALRB, as well as a multitude of other services, and how to protect themselves during COVID-19. And COVID-19 testing was also available. This was a pilot initiative by Listos, which is a division within Cal OES and part of one of the governor's initiatives to help vulnerable communities better prepare themselves for disasters and emergency preparedness. And we're hoping, if successful, that it can serve as a pilot for other similar events in the community. It was great to get out there, and it was done, we think, in a pretty safe and effective manner. Last but not least, I'd like to turn over the floor and welcome one of our newest additions to the labor agency family, the Labor and Workforce Development Agency Associate Secretary for Farm Worker Liaison and Immigrant Services, Sebastian Sanchez. Governor Newsom appointed Secretary Sanchez at the end of June of this year, and he's been on the job about 2 months. And he previously worked at, I believe, Vet-Cetic and CRLA. And I'm excited to turn it over to him so he can share a little bit more about the work that he's doing with Labor Agency and his vision for that role. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you all. Last time that I joined this call, it was my second day on the job, so I feel like you are now getting a full-on veteran that has all the knowledge and all the understanding of everything that is impacting farm workers throughout the state. So Victoria asked me to speak a bit about what I hope my work will look like and what I plan to work on during my tenure as the Associate Secretary with the Labor Agency on these issues. So I wanted to talk briefly about, I think there are 4 separate areas of work that kind of interrelate, but also are separate areas of work. One of the things that I really want to focus on is making sure that we can increase the accessibility to farm workers to the services that our different departments, divisions, and boards already provide. One of the basic things that we did to address this is, for example, with regards to COVID-19, we developed and put together a website for farm workers, specifically for farm worker resources, specifically on COVID-19, really focusing on collecting all the materials that were available and making sure that there were materials that are graphic heavy, that are video based, that are conscious of the fact that many farm workers might not have the literacy levels or understanding to be able to read through some of the more detailed FAQs that our departments and divisions tend to put together. And I really want to focus on creating new content and pushing our different, again, all of the different agencies, departments, divisions, and boards, which I'll just refer to as departments going forward, to create content that is accessible to the community at large. And I really see it as creating 3 different layers of materials. What I would say we currently have on most of our websites and most of the information that we put out and distribute is more at a level 3, and it's information that is more accessible to advocates. I know that as a workers' rights attorney, sometimes I would frequently turn to the information put out by the departments to be able to explain to workers what changes in law were happening. But at times, even as an attorney, it would be something that I'd have to sit and read through and make sure that I properly understood. So I want to make sure that we focus on creating a second level that just simplifies that information, puts it into video format, or maybe just has less words, and really just simplifies the main points that we want to categorize, and then drives people to different resources for additional information. And then at that first level, I really want to create super simplistic content that are just flyers that any worker, just by the graphic representation, would understand basic rights. Just basic information, whether we're talking about supplemental paid sick leave, the workers' comp presumption that just came out, just something really quickly that workers immediately understand that there is a right, and then guides them to whether it's, for example, the ALRB helpline on COVID-19, or another hotline or another website that can provide them with more information. I want to create that level of content so that it's really accessible and it's really useful for workers. Through that, I'm also just working on to make these services more accessible. I want to work with the ALRB, with EDD's Migrant Seasonal Farm Worker Program, to improve our outreach to workers. I know you'll hear more about the ALRB helpline. It's something that I'm really excited to support and figure out ways that I can support the work that the ALRB itself is doing on this. But some of the things that I want to provide support on is helping develop better protocols with referrals to other departments. So making sure that when a case goes, if the ALRB receives a call from a worker on a health and safety issue, making sure that when that case is referred to Cal OSHA, that there's follow-up, that there's a clear understanding of what happens to the case at Cal OSHA, what kind of priority is given to that case, what the outcome is of that case, so that we have an understanding of how effective is the helpline, how much better can we serve farm workers when we provide them with a direct helpline. I'm also helping to coordinate regular meetings with other departments to make sure that there's a constant conversation going on about what we can do to better serve farm workers. And this is something that I'm trying to implement with all the other departments that our labor agency supervises. So not just Cal OSHA, but the Labor Commissioner's Office, the Labor Employment Task Force that the Department of Industrial Relations operates, as well as EDD in the Division of Workers' Compensation. With EDD's Migrant Seasonal Farm Worker Population, program, I'm also working with them to help cross-train their outreach workers and their housing investigators so that we can expand our capacity to do outreach to workers directly through that program, and to also be better able to identify possible violations. So when our outreach workers are going out, they should also keep an eye open for possible violations that they can then communicate to the relevant agency or industry. So that covers 2 areas. One is increasing access and also supporting that interagency coordination of services. One of the larger things that I'm working on right now, a third thing, is the Strategic Outreach Initiative. As many of you may be aware, the state budget was amended to provide our agency with a pot of money to do community education, both to employers and to workers on COVID-19. This is an outreach initiative that we are developing right now, the structure of what that will look like. We have spent the past month and a half calling, I would say, well over 100 organizations to talk through with them what this structure would look like, what their capacity is to support, and to really understand how we can best leverage our partnerships with community-based organizations to reach as many workers and employers as possible with the information we want to develop for them. We are working really closely with various of the UCs for the ag context, in particular with UC Davis's Western Center on Agricultural Health and Safety, on developing new materials that address some of the gaps that might currently exist, that address some of the rising situations and scenarios, to create new workshops and trainings for example, mayordomos or supervisors, to help them understand what they need to do to address particular questions that farm labor contractors may have, that employers might have, so that we can really build on creating I would say a stronger sense of voluntary compliance from employers, so that we can focus any enforcement efforts just on some of those employers that are not interested in voluntarily complying. We also are working on creating new materials for workers that is responsive both to their linguistic and cultural needs. So working on with a lot of these CBOs to customize the materials. Victoria mentioned the event by OES that I also had the pleasure of attending on Friday. And one of the things that I was really impressed by is that OES has managed to put together a lot of their information in audio format for various mixteco variants. I think this is something that all of our departments and agencies should be doing. There's no reason that all of us shouldn't be putting together materials that are specifically responsive to large communities of farm workers that currently exist. So that is something that I'm really stressing and hoping to be able to push out and make sure that everything that we put together is responsive at that level. And I think the last area of work that I'm focusing on is on workforce development. It's the other part of my job. And one of the things that I want to highlight is we are looking to develop more our strategy around integrated education and training. And particularly in the ag world, is figuring out how can we create better jobs for workers? How can we create better access to workers for the current jobs, whether there's more technology that's coming into this particular sector, whether there's particular needs that farm employers may have. We want to identify where there are those spaces where we can better train workers to provide them an opportunity to have better paying jobs. So we are working with some of the local community colleges, some of the local workforce boards to try to identify new initiatives that can really serve as pilots and examples of what we can do when we find an employer that is willing to invest on training up their workforce to provide them with better opportunities to progress in that space. So those are the 4 broad areas of work that I'm focusing on at the moment. I know that certainly with 2 months, I don't have a full perspective of what can really be done. But these are the areas that we're prioritizing at the moment. And I know that things will change as I continue doing the work, but hopefully this can spark some new ideas that can come out of this work. And I always think that I should be very flexible. And if something needs to change or there's something else that needs to take priority, I'm willing to do that. But I just wanted to share those 4 general areas of work, and happy to take any questions that folks may have about anything related to what I just talked about, more about my past experience. But yeah, just wanted to introduce and talk a bit about what I'm doing.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's wonderful to have you. I think we very much enjoyed the work we've already done in the short time you've been here, and are continuing to looking forward to effectuating a lot of these initiatives. I'd love to open it up to my colleagues to see if any of them have any questions or comments.
Briefly, Sebastian, welcome. I'm so happy that we're going to be working together in an official capacity, and I know the ALRB is incredibly excited to work alongside you, and thank you for sharing your work plan, and just generally excited. Welcome.
Thank you, Cynthia.
I'd like to join second that welcome. Delighted to have you aboard, and I think all the areas you've outlined are really terrific. One thing I wanted to note is that you mentioned in the EDD outreach workers, they can be the eyes and ears of their sister agencies. They're out there every day, and I think that's a really valuable resource. So I sort of second the effort to get them involved.
Yeah.
Connect.
I too want to welcome you, and I also third the comments of my colleagues. I look forward to working with you, and welcome aboard. Thank you.
I'll take a fourth and a fifth if y'all want, but going back to the EDD outreach workers, I do want to stress that, you know, the lead there, Cornelio Gomez, who some of you may know or have worked with, has been really excited about pushing this and cross-training and getting the outreach workers back into the field. They've put a substantial amount of effort in training their outreach workers on how to do it safely during the pandemic. So that just got restarted earlier this month. The training's finished up. We're providing more trainings to the staff from the various departments as well. So we're going to get them trainings from Cal OSHA, from the Labor Commissioner's Office, to really make sure that they're aware of the possible violations that may come up. So I'm excited about that as well.
Thank you. I'd like to open up if there's any other questions from anyone else in the meeting or comments. Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Very much appreciate it. Before moving on to the next agenda item, I was remiss in forgetting to note that we are recording this Zoom, and our public meetings are available on our YouTube channel, and we do post those so people who are unable to make the meeting are able to participate and see what's going on. So I do want to let everyone know that it's participating right now, that we are recording. We started recording at 10 a.m. on the dot at the start of the meeting. Moving on to the next agenda item is the Executive Officer's Report on Elections, Unfair Labor Practices, and Hearings.
Yes, good morning, Chair Hasid and members of the board. In this report, which along with the litigation report will be posted at our website for interested parties to look at and download, I'll be covering elections, unfair labor practice complaints, and hearings. Commencing with elections, and all of this information is data that comes from August 11th, the date of our last public board meeting, to the present. Since then, there have been no notices of intent to take access, nor any notices of intent to organize all these. There has been one election petition filed. There was a petition for decertification that was filed. However, on October 1st, the date of its filing, the Teamsters Local number 63, which was the certified bargaining representative, submitted a letter disclaiming interest in representing the bargaining unit. There have been two complaints issued by the General Counsel, one in Anthony Vineyards Incorporated in Kern County, California, the second Coast King Packing LLC, and the employer in Monterey County, California. Since the date of our last public board meeting, there have been 4 post-complaint settlements. One in B&H Flowers Incorporated, which the parties entered into an informal bilateral settlement agreement. The second, Eat Sweet Farms LLC and Durant Harvesting Inc., where they entered into an informal unilateral settlement agreement. The third, San Miguel Produce Incorporated, they entered into an informal settlement agreement. And finally, for Philip Verway Farms, where the parties entered into an informal bilateral settlement agreement. There have been no in-person or virtual hearings held. However, there have been a number of pre-hearing conferences, case managed conferences, and settlement conferences related to the matters that are pending in the adjudication unit. Since our last meeting, there's been one administrative law judge decision issued, and that was in Ocean Mist Farms and an employer in Riverside County. There have been 2 board decisions. The first, Smith Packing Incorporated, a employer in Santa Barbara County, and the second, Rincon Pacific LLC, an employer in Ventura County. There have been 2 board administrative orders issued, both in Coast King Packing, which involves the employer in Monterey County. Finally, cases pending before the board for decision or action. There are 3 now, if you include the petition for decertification, the John DeGroot and Son Dairy. The other matters involve Ocean Mist Farms and United Farm Workers of America and that involves an application for special permission to appeal the ruling of the administrative law judge. That concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions relating to those matters.
Thank you, Santiago. Do any board members have questions? Any members of the public? Okay, thank you so much. Going on to agenda item number 5, the litigation report, turning it over to Todd.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. I submitted a report to the board. Doesn't look like it's gotten to the site yet, but like Santiago said, we will get them up there. So I will try to rattle through this quickly. There hasn't been a lot of updates since the last meeting in August. So I'll start with in the California Supreme Court, Growen Farming Inc. Versus ALRB, case number S264099. Growen has filed a petition for review in the California Supreme Court seeking review of the 5th Appellate District's published opinion upholding the board's decision in 44 ALRB number 1. That petition was filed on August 24th. The board filed an answer to the petition on September 14th, and Growen filed its reply on September 23rd. And the matter is currently pending order from the court whether to grant or deny the petition. The deadline for the court to order review is October 23rd. In the 5th Appellate District, Wonderful Orchards versus ALRB, case number F081172. This is a petition for writ of review of the board's decision in 46 ALRB number 2. The parties filed a stipulation on August 12th to extend the briefing periods for the board and the reply brief. The board, per that stipulation, filed its brief on September 21st. Wonderful's reply is now due on November 16th, after which briefing will be complete. And then in United Farm Workers of America versus ALRB, case number F080469. This is a petition for writ of review of the board's decisions in 45 ALRB numbers 8 and 4. The board filed a respondent's brief on October 9th, and Growen also filed an opposition brief that same day. The UFW's reply brief currently is due November 3rd, after which briefing will be complete. And then finally, last but certainly not least, in the United States Supreme Court, we have the matter of Cedar Point Nursery versus Seed, case number 20-107. This is a petition for writ of certiorari of the Ninth Circuit's opinion dismissing a constitutional takings challenge to the board's access regulation. Since the last meeting, the board obtained an extension of time to file its response to the petition. Amicus briefs in support of the petition were filed by the California Farm Bureau Federation, the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, Mountain States Legal Foundation, the Cato Institute and National Federation of Independent Business, Small Business Legal Center, the Institute for Justice, the American Farm Bureau Federation, and the Southeastern Legal Foundation, and also the states of Oklahoma, Arizona, Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Nebraska, and Texas. And per the prior extension of time obtained by the board filed its response to the petition on October 2nd. All of those materials are available on the court's website, and we are currently awaiting for the matter to be distributed to Conference of the Justices. And that's it.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate that report. Do any of my colleagues have any questions or comments? Any questions or comments from the public? Okay, great. Moving on to the next agenda item. It will be agenda item number 6, the General Counsel's report.
Good morning, everyone. Chair Hasid and board members, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Julie Montgomery, the General Counsel of the ALRB. For those of you that may be joining us for the first time, the General Counsel office is the part of the ALRB that investigates unfair labor practice charges in our 5 regional or field offices. And when we find a violation, we issue a complaint and try it at hearing before an administrative law judge. And we also do a number of other things such as outreach and administer elections, the regional staff does, and effectuate compliance with the board order. So I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight some of the work in the regional offices. There's a lot of activity that goes on with our offices and our staff that isn't on the website. So I want to start out by highlighting some settlements that we have achieved since the last board meeting with our regional director, Francesca Herrera's leadership. The Salinas region has been very productive in achieving settlements this past period, and in fact has settled 5 cases that were set for hearing. And these are cases in which we conducted a full investigation, found evidence of a violation of our act, and filed a complaint, and we're preparing for hearing. And for those of you that have done this kind of work before, you know there's a lot that goes into that. And so our staff's been working really hard at that, and we have achieved 5 such settlements. And I'll just kind of as a group, just in the interest of time, I'll go through a few of them, or just a few details. So there was a case against a grower called Eat Sweet in Santa Maria, in which our investigation found that workers were disciplined and later fired for speaking up about concerns with working conditions, including poor treatment by their foremen. And in that settlement, the employer compensated the workers for their economic losses, I mean, most of which were back wages, as I think $3,500. So they didn't have a lot of wage loss, but they did get what they lost. And there will be noticing to the workforce where ALRB staff will go in and inform workers of the case. We also settled a case for 5 workers who were harvesting greens for San Miguel Produce in Ventura County. And our investigation found they were unlawfully terminated in retaliation for complaining about a reduction in their piece rates. And we were able to settle that case for $33,000 to the 5 workers to compensate them for their losses, as well as a mailing to the employees. We're not doing noticing in that case, as the employer did close its operations. But if they do resume within a year, we'll do the noticing at that time, and the workers will be offered reinstatement. We also settled a complaint against Scarborough Farms, and our investigation there found that grower in Ventura County retaliated against a lettuce harvester because she complained about the location and poor conditions of the bathrooms in the fields and a lack of drinking water. And we found she made these complaints on behalf of herself and her monolingual Mixteco speaking coworkers. And so we settled that case prior to hearing, not too long before hearing, where the company agreed to pay the worker for her economic losses, which was a little over $1,100. And that company had also closed, but we will do the reading and noticing if they resume their operations within a year. We also found a violation was committed by B&H Flowers in Santa Barbara County, which is a cannabis grower. And we found that they terminated 5 workers because they complained about poor treatment from their supervisor. And in that case, we also settled prior to hearing for $32,800 for economic losses to the workers. And we are doing reading and noticing at that workplace as well. And then the last complaint that we settled in the past couple months is we concluded that Chapala Berry Farms in Santa Cruz County unlawfully suspended and terminated 2 strawberry harvesters in retaliation for complaining about crew assignments. And we received a little over $4,000 for those 2 workers to compensate them for their economic losses. And they are going to grant ALRB agents access to conduct reading and noticing to the employees about the settlement during peak season. And when we go in and do that reading and noticing, we go in the fields, talk to the workers at their workplace without supervisors present, and tell them what the case was about, what settlement was achieved, who we are, what we do. So it's an important way to remedy the violation, to let workers know that that there was a remedy for this violation, and that helps reduce what we call the chilling impact of those actions. And so those are the complaints that the Salinas office had settled these past couple months. And moving on to our Visalia office, I'll just briefly mention that that they have been busy effectuating compliance for a board order in which the board found that our Nato brothers had engaged in bad faith bargaining with the United Farm Workers, and our staff mediated a settlement with the employer, or with all the parties, in June, and or it was approved in June, and our staff in Visalia distributed over 33 checks last month that totaled $28,651, and they are planning to deliver a total of 70 checks. They have another distribution, I think, that's coming up soon. So we are actually putting money into workers' hands as a result of that case. So that's always an exciting thing to do, and very, very gratifying to be able to give people their checks who've waited so long. And another important component of what the General Counsel's Office does is outreach. As I mentioned in our last meeting, we are collaborating closely with our Labor Workforce Development Agency, Sebastian Sanchez, and the work that he highlighted earlier in this meeting, and our sister departments, Department of Industrial Relations, Employment Development Department, and EDD, and some others, to really come up with a comprehensive plan and messaging so that workers can get the information they need in a format that is accessible to them. And so we are working closely with our partners on that project. We have conducted interviews for our 3 outreach positions, which we're adding toward this project, and we really hope to make offers very soon. That's our plan. And our office, and we have also had our Deputy General Counsel, Silas Shaver, spend a fair amount of his time working together with Sebastian at Labor and others at Labor Agency and with our sister departments to really help get a solid plan off the ground, so that we can all be on the same page and work most effectively, and also work with our local community-based organizations who are on the ground working with the farm worker community more directly, to make sure that the information is getting to the right places in a understandable format. So Silas is doing a lot of work on that right now. And we have also opened up our 800 number. We have for those of you that don't know, the ALRB has an 800 number that is statewide and available to anyone. You can call around the state who wants to reach the ALRB, and we do staff that line, and we have real people answering the phone, live people. And we have opened that line up statewide for not only ALRB issues, but any issues or concerns that farm workers have about COVID-related matters. And we finalized a trifold brochure together with our sister departments and Labor Agency that has information for farm workers, such as the right to sick leave, a safe and healthy workplace, unemployment benefits, and other things. And so we have provided several trainings within the past couple months to our staff on the different laws in this regard, and resources, and how to make referrals. We've been having meetings, and Silas has been working hard to connect the different representatives in these departments together so that we can make sure that we're making effective referrals to the right place and that people are getting in the system and actually getting the help they need. So that line is opened up. We have started to get some calls, and we've actually distributed well over 10,000 of these brochures. And I would imagine it's been even more than that. We've been giving a large number of them to different groups who are going out and doing food distributions, mass distributions. Our sister departments have been printing and distributing them en masse as well. We distributed thousands at the event in Mendota that Board Chair Hasid mentioned. And so we are working hard to get the word out and do other outreach to let people know that this resource exists. And we're also on our IT department at the ALRB is helping us get a more updated helpline system to be able to easily track these calls and just make it more efficient and useful for our staff. So we're embarking on that project and hope that we can be a resource not only to people on issues that directly impact the ALRB, but just helping people get to where they need to go within the state, because it is a confusing process for even those who may know a little bit about it. And so for farm workers, I think it is, it's hard to know exactly who to call for what issue. And so that's what we are here to help with. And we also have our local office staff engaging in outreach. Last month, some of our staffing in Monterey County had an outreach training, participated in outreach training with the Monterey County Health Department. There were other state departments and nonprofits serving farm workers that all came together to do this training. We also participated in a legal clinic at a food distribution event in Sonoma County, together with some local nonprofits. And so although our in-person outreach has been more limited just because of the situation with COVID, we are doing what we can. And as Board Chair Hasid mentioned, several of us attended the event in Mendota, and I thought it worked really well. We all had our masks on the entire time, and the workers were driving through in a line to get the information from people. And so I'm really hopeful that that's a model that we can replicate and get out there and continue to do that in-person outreach in a safe manner. As we know, there's a lot of fear out in our communities, and trust is a real issue. So that in-person contact is still important, in addition to social media and radio and television, the other forums that we're utilizing. So that is my hope, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has questions.
Opening up to questions, but also just want to say thank you, Julie, to you and your staff for all the work that you're doing. We are a pretty small staff. You would think we had hundreds of employees by the sound of that list, but want to commend the Salinas region for all their work on settlements. I think that's always a great way to resolve an issue, especially expediently, and minimizing the need for contentious litigation, and also just all the work that you're doing on the helpline. We're really hoping that the helpline, the hotline, can serve as a resource for all of our farm workers statewide to get the information and resources that they need. I feel like the theme of this meeting and a lot of our work right now is about better communication and accessibility, and you and your team are doing a lot to effectuate that. So I really want to thank you.
Oh yeah, it's our pleasure, and everyone's very dedicated and concerned about the situation. I just also forgot to mention that our Visalia staff is integrally involved with the Central Valley Task Force, which is through the Office of Emergency Services, the state of California. And our regional director, Chris Schneider, has really taken a leadership role in that group. And we're really trying to be the voice of farm workers, low-wage workers in that conversation. And several of us have also been participating in a statewide task force that the governor's office has convened, Board Chair Hasid and member Cynthia Flores, myself, and Silas Schauber have all, and Sebastian Sanchez, we've all participated in that group in which we're talking with different departments and organizations to try to address issues that farm workers are facing. So we're trying to, we're all working to come together and communicate effectively to figure out what are the problems, what are the issues, and how can we best address them.
Do any of my colleagues have any questions or comments for General Counsel? Okay, any questions or comments from members of the public? Richard Mines?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, Julia, that in the cost project, we have 6 CBOs, and we're coming up with a leaflet we're passing out to many, many people. And your ADA number is going to be on there prominently displayed. So thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic
you.
to hear. Really glad to hear that.
That's wonderful. And it looks like our one of our regional directors, Francesca Herrera, has put the 800 number in the chat. Thank you so much, Francesca, for those of you that want to see that and distribute that to your networks. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you so much, Julie, and thanks again to all of your team. Going on to our next agenda item, we have a report from the Division of Administration Services. Brian?
Hi there, I'm Brian Doherty. I'm the Chief of the Administrative Services Division. I've got a couple of updates to share. As Julia just talked about on the recruitment side, we are currently actively trying to fill the 3 BCP positions that we received funding for back in July. And we're in the interview and candidate selection stage of those recruitments. As a reminder, those are 2 positions for training and community engagement specialists, one in Visalia office and one in the Salinas office. And those are both being recruited at the AGPA level. And we have one staff services manager, 1 position that is to serve as the outreach program manager and communication director for the outreach project. So hopefully we will have candidates selected in the very near future, and we'll have staff on board to be able to do those important functions. As far as the additional positions within HR, we currently have 4 vacancies within ALRB's 64 authorized positions, which results in a 7.7% vacancy rate. Those vacancies consist of 2 vacancies in the General Counsel's office that are in Visalia. It's a field examiner 2 and an attorney 1 position, both which currently have active recruitments underway. And we have 2 vacancies on the board side, one for an AGPA position and one for a legal secretary position. So we're doing very well. This is probably the lowest vacancy rate the ALRB has had in quite some time. So we are doing very well as far as the recruitment and filling these positions. A couple additional updates. We have completed, admin was able to complete the deployment of a new VoIP phone system for ALRB that was rolled out to all of 6 offices across the state, and had AT&T provide online training to all the end users on the new functionality of this phone system. This is timing wise was very well, because our phone system was kind of aging, and moving to the new VoIP platform will allow more flexibility for ALRB to meet worker needs, specifically as we're transitioning to a more remote workforce. It will allow us to be able to roll phones and ultimately move towards being able to take phone calls directly through computers as well. So it will provide more flexibility to allow workers to have more office-like features from their remote workforce location. In addition, as Julia spoke a little bit about as well, Rafael Diaz, our IT information security officer, has been working closely with AT&T to configure our the functionality of our 800 number to be able to address the additional call center functionality that we're going to be needing to be able to move forward with based on the additional outreach that is occurring. This functionality that we're looking to procure will basically allow up to about 12 operators within ALRB and 4 managers to utilize their laptops to take additional phone calls that are coming through the 800 number, so that we can be able to manage the queue, be able to have statistics about the number of phone calls that are coming in, be able to track call wait times, and be able to have more flexibility in ensuring that we are promptly responding to phone calls that come in through that COVID-related topics due to the LWDA and ALRB outreach efforts that are occurring. So those are kind of the top areas of focus for admin over the last couple of months since our last board meeting.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really proud of all the work that our team has done to have a low vacancy rate. I think that's really critical for us. And also just want to thank you and your team for all that you've done to make sure that our telephonic technology is actually up to date. It's one of our primary ways of keeping in touch with all of the population that we serve, and it's really critical. And you guys have just done a lot of Herculean work, as you know all too well, in a short amount of time. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Brian? Okay, moving on. Our next agenda item is item number 8, the regulation report. Todd?
Nothing to report on regulations today.
Thank you. Just do want to share a friendly reminder for all of our stakeholders that are participating that we are undergoing we do have a subcommittee. Board Member Lightstone and Board Member Broad are reviewing our current regulations, and we're looking to revise our regulations early next year, and also have a discussion about that at our December meeting. If you do have any comments or proposed regulatory changes, please send those to our Executive Officer, Santiago Avila Gomez. We are still in the pre-rulemaking phase, but we are hoping to go into that rulemaking in early 2021. Moving on to agenda item number 9, the legislative report.
Again, no updates on the legislation or amendments to our act.
Thank you, Todd. Okay, moving on to agenda item number 10 is the personnel report, and the board does not have any personnel items to report at this time. So we'll now be moving on to agenda item number 11, the public comment. Please be advised that the board is unable to adjudicate, comment, or resolve any pending case matters before the board. I will ask our Executive Secretary, Santiago Villa Gomez, to first go through the queue for public comment to the extent we have one, and then open it up for others who wish to have a comment. If you are having technical difficulties or miss your turn, we will work to come back to you. And please remember to be on mute unless you are speaking. If you require translation, please advise us, and we will make sure to get those services. Santiago, do we have anyone in the comment queue?
None pending.
Anyone else who would like to have a question or public comment? Okay, all right. We're now going to move on to our informational panel, which I'm very excited about, which is engaging the Indigenous farm worker population. Several months ago, several ALRB board members, as well as many members of our staff, had the opportunity to participate in a webinar series that was hosted by the Ventura County Child and Family Welfare Services Agency. And through the course of that series, we were able to learn more about California's Indigenous population more generally, and gain insights from local government as well as CBOs, community-based organizations, I should say, about some of the issues that that population faces and ways that we can work to improve them. We wanted to have a more focused discussion on the Indigenous population in the farm worker community, and that is the focus of our panel today. And we thought that was imperative to discuss as a board and focus on the issues that affect them. And so hopefully we can improve the way we serve that population. I want to extend a very special thank you to Board Member Flores for taking the lead on initiating this panel discussion today and helping to coordinate that. I'm very excited to hear from our panelists, some of which who participated in the webinar that we had the opportunity to participate in a few months ago. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. We will first hear from Rick Mines, who will provide a primer on the Indigenous populations in California's farm worker workforce. Our second panelist will be Gaspar Rivera Salgado, the project director for the UCLA Labor Center, who will address cultural competency as an integral factor to engage Indigenous farm workers. And then our third panelist will be Marisa Lundeen, the legal director of the Indigenous program for CRLA, and she will discuss language justice as an integral factor in communicating with Indigenous farm workers. With that, I will turn it over to our first panelist, Richard Mines.
Hi, I think I have a slideshow that's going to come on in a second. I'm really excited to hear all the activity at the ALRB. It's great to hear. I'm gonna expose you to a lot of data. So this is an overview from data sources. So anytime you want to interrupt and ask a question, please do. It's very comprehensive, and so please interrupt whenever you want. Hi, Silas.
Hey, Rick, I'll interrupt you. Don't worry.
Good. Can you put on the slideshow?
Santiago, are you able to assist with that PowerPoint?
Right, Santiago, if you could just give me access to share screen.
Okay, working on that now. Okay, you should have that ability now, Cynthia. It'll be along the bottom of your screen.
Oh, great.
Okay, so
thank you, Santiago.
So let's see, can you move it over a little bit to the right? Let's see, can you go, oh, there it is. It's that maybe that's the first one. So anyway, maybe the other, it seems a little bit off my screen. Maybe you should leave it like that. I don't know. I can't see it. In a smaller one, I can see it.
I think it may be, yeah, I think it may be better in the editing format because it just, it's not.
Yeah, put it in the editing format. Okay, so who are the Indigenous? So I'm going to talk about these topics, where they come from, where they go to, why they're both creators of wealth and impoverished at the same time, how they compare with other farm workers, with mestizo farm workers, what are their special needs and conditions, and how they reacted differently to COVID. And throughout this, I'm going to talk about something called a tight hometown networks, which I'm sure Gaspar and others will mention, and Marisa. I think that's the best way to think about, understand, and study this community. Next slide, please. So who are the Indigenous? Outsiders can't define them. Their identity is very peculiar to each small group, and they have to define themselves. As Gaspar will mention later, many more people identify as Indigenous than speak the language. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to use three sources. The Indigenous Farm Workers Survey, which we did in 2008, 2007 to 2008. It has enormous detail. It's a convenience sample. Then there's a random sample survey, the NAWS survey, National Agricultural Workers Survey, which has been started in 1988, but it does about 700 interviews a year in California, and it's very good for comparing between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And finally, the COF survey, which we just did just now, as a sample of 915 convenience sample, and 6 frontline organizations, Leaders Campesinos, groups like that, did the survey, and we helped organize it, CRS. Okay, next slide, please. So where they come from, and Gaspar will go into more detail about this, but there's large groups of language, native languages, but most of them come from Oaxaca, Guerrero, Puebla, and Michoacan. You see that 80% are from Oaxaca. These are California farm workers. The 10% from Guerrero and Puebla and other Chiapas and Michoacan. A few come from there, but you see 80% from Oaxaca, 10% from Guerrero. And the languages in our survey in 2008 is probably hasn't changed all that much since then because it's the stability of the migration. Mixtecos are about 54%, Zapotecos 25%, Triqui 10%, Nahuatl and so forth, Chatino and many others languages have small representations, but half, 90% are Mixteco, Triqui, and Zapoteco. Next slide, please. There's a long history of migration and discrimination in this group, you know, since the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish. They are traditionally a very self-sufficient culture. Up until 1940, they made their own clothes, their own food, cooked their own, they grew their own food. They had their own agricultural implements and so forth. But in about 1940, the economy started changing. People from other places came in and started selling stuff. They started buying clothes and cars and agricultural implements and so forth. And so they had to start migrating to pay for it. First, they went to sugar in Veracruz, then they went to vegetables in the Northwest. They didn't cross to the United States till the 1970s, and almost very large numbers started coming in the 1990s. Now, under the colony, they were forced to do abusive contract labor, and under the Republic, they were subject to a thing called desindianización, which meant that their languages were obliterated by the government. And they would have been and continue to be discriminated against in employment, receipt of services, and they're made fun of in popular culture in Mexico all the time and mocked by, you know, in radio and so forth, you know, el indito. So, and the discrimination continues in California because most of their supervisors, their landlords, their shopkeepers are mestizos that are dealing with them. You know, why don't you speak Spanish? What's the matter with you? You're Mexican. So the discrimination continues. Next slide, please. But they have adopted and survived very well. They haven't been obliterated. The cultural groups adapted, keeping their distinct age-old customs. They have strict rules about citizenship in their hometowns. Land is not held privately generally, but given to citizens for use. Male citizens are expected to fill all kinds of public jobs like mayors and clinic directors, public health directors. These are called cargos, and also expected to do manual labor called tequios. And the men have to return to the village or hire somebody, pay somebody else to take those jobs, or they lose their usufruct rights, their right to plant land, and some have even lost their houses. So this is seen by a burden by some, but the usos y costumbres, this is what the whole system is called, have kept the communities together in face of severe discrimination by mestizo society. Next slide, please. Okay, the indigenous are creators of wealth. Indigenous farm workers, California farm workers. The networks make decisions about the distribution of their population between the home area and the United States to minimize their families' costs. Men of working age, many here without their families, represent a large portion of the population of indigenous immigrants. You can see in the slide that the red is female, blue is male. The ones in the United States in these nuclear families, we ask everybody in the family. The males are mostly in the United States. Females, there's fewer in Mexico, but there's more of a female population. Next slide, please. The couples come up. A lot of couples come up by themselves, leave their children back with their grandparents, and bring the boys up mostly when they're of working age. This is a very, very hard-working employed group. You can see in the slide, and the children and mothers work. If a month or 2 or 3 months a year they work, you can see in the slide that as the kids get older, they work a month or more in the field. These are numbers, so you can see that 80% of the kids are working. Another thing is that there's a high percentage of unaccompanied. The unaccompanied men are always a high proportion of farm workers in the United States, of Mexican farmers in the United States. But the indigenous have even a higher percentage. You can see that the unaccompanied among the indigenous, the orange bar, is 52%, with only 36%, or a third among non-indigenous. So they have more people that are working. They don't have children that aren't a burden on our social services because they're here by themselves without their families. Next slide, please. Also, another thing that keeps down the cost of the indigenous is they follow the crops. You can see on the slide the FTC stands for follow the crop. You can see that 3 times as many indigenous, the orange bar, follow the crop than the blue. They're going up to Oregon and Washington principally in the networks we saw. So you see that they're inexpensive labor for the California economy. The rest of us benefit from the fact There's still them, many of them are working. They're so such a hardworking and migratory group. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the indigenous are poorer than the mestizos. I'm going to run through a bunch of slides that shows you how poor they are. The average, the crowdedness is judged by the Census Bureau. If you're more than 1.5 per room, excluding kitchens and bathrooms, you're considered extremely crowded. You can see here that in our study in 2008, the indigenous were 1.75. You can see it along the coast, it's even worse, where there's Watsonville, Salinas, Ventura, so forth, Santa Maria, they're up. Watsonville is the extraordinary 3 per room, very, very crowded. 2 and 3 families per maybe a 2-bedroom apartment. And the people don't necessarily want to be with the people they're with. Some are with family, but others are with strangers. And one woman told me one time, I want to live with my husband and my children alone. I don't want to be with 2 other families. This is a very extremely crowded population. You can see also in the NAWS data. NAWS is the National Agricultural Worker Survey data from the 2014-16 period, the most recent data that I have. You can see that the indigenous in the orange exceed 43% in the NAWS exceed the 2 per room. Whereas the non-indigenous, which is also a very, very high rate, 28%. But the indigenous, more crowded. Next slide, please. They have fewer assets than the indigenous, than the mestizos. The indigenous, orange again, they own a car. Half the time you need a car to get to work. The non-indigenous mestizos, 60% of the time. Almost all farm workers in California are Mexicans, Mexican-born, about 95%. Only about 2 or 3% are U.S. born. And only
Rick, can I ask a question about indigenous versus mestizo?
Yes.
Are there a lot of mixed families where you have indigenous and mestizo, or do you find that it's pretty easy to sort of identify one from the other in terms of your study and your statistics?
The answer to the second question is no, it's not easy to tell. The answer to the first question is I don't think there's a lot of mixing. I think they're pretty like my grandma didn't like Gentiles, they're pretty a closed community, and so I don't think there's a lot of mixing, in the first generation. With respect to the second question, yes, it's hard to tell who indigenous is because you can't go just on the language. You have to ask them for their identity. Now, in the NAWS, they have a bunch of questions, and I think it's pretty good. But all these data are approximate in the sense that some of the non-indigenous probably are indigenous and don't want to. I remember I talked to a guy in a laundromat, a Purepecha speaking guy, and he spoke terrible Spanish. I said, "Where are you from?" He said, he had denied that he was Purepecha. There's a tendency to not. There are some that are non-indigenous that really are indigenous. Next slide, please. They also have poor working conditions. Farm labor contractors are associated with poor working conditions. You can see that on the right side there, the indigenous work for farm labor contractors more than the non-indigenous. Next slide, please. There's 3 common measures of poor working conditions that I use and many other survey researchers use, and it's hard to get at poor working conditions. And so we use pay for equipment, pay for rides, and piece rate. That's if one group has got more of it than the other, that indicates they're probably being mistreated more than the other group. So here you see that more pay for equipment, 1.5 times as many, twice as many pay for rides, and twice as many do piece rates. So there's a measure of poor working conditions for the indigenous. Next slide, please. They're paid less. Here, both hourly and piece rate in the NAWS and National Agricultural Worker Survey. the indigenous are paid, 15, 20% less than the non-indigenous. Next slide, please. Now, why are they more impoverished? Now, they're impoverished because of discrimination, because of 500 years of discrimination against a group that has really been terribly treated in Mexico and continues to be treated poorly by the Mexican mestizos in the United States, and by the children of mestizos and other Americans. But there's other factors that are important that you should know about. They come from very remote villages. About half are less than 500 people in 2008. When I ran through the Mexican census and figured it out, they come from very small places. In the NAWS, indigenous had 5.7 years of school, mestizos 7.8 years of school. They're younger. They came more recently, 13.7 years ago instead of 19.3 years ago. And they're younger, 35 instead of 38 years old. So they're a younger and more recently arrived group and a more poorly educated group. Next slide, please. They came after IRCA, and this is a little bit startling maybe for some of you, but you see that 87% in the NAWS, in 2016, 14, 15, 16, are unauthorized. 55% of the mestizos are unauthorized. So about 45% are work authorized among the mestizos. Only 13% among the among the indigenous are authorized to work in the United States. So it's that really reflects on owning houses, on how much they're paid, and whether the foreman is discounting their wages and so forth. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you that I found this in the NAWS by going from the data, and I couldn't use the indigenous definition here because I don't trust the earlier data in the NAWS for defining indigenous. They weren't asking enough questions back at the beginning, and so I use a proxy which is southern Mexico. Most of the people from southern Mexico are indigenous. Most of the people from not southern Mexico aren't. I figure about over probably 90% of the ones from not from southern Mexico are not indigenous. So I made this comparison. So this is a percentage of the total California farm labor force that are from southern Mexico among all Mexicans. Total Mexican California farm labor force. So in the 91-93 period, 5% were from the south. Then it went up precipitously. In those years, half of all the newcomers, the one in the first year in agriculture, were from the south. They were just pouring into agriculture. And there's a fast turnover. There was until recently a fast turnover in agriculture. So the indigenous were coming in at a very high rate up to 2008, and then we sense a decline since then. I don't think it's so much leaving, though a lot of them left, especially from the construction industry. But I think there's fewer coming in now. I'm all groups, but the indigenous especially. Okay, so next slide, please. So where do the indigenous go in California? Again, I have to go back to 2007 data. I have no idea. There's no surveys done, that I know of that really, it's all wags, wild ass guesses about where people are. But these, we actually did a hometown count. We sent out 40 interviewers, and we counted 350 towns around California. We counted where they were, and you can see that we know from that count that first people came up to San Diego, then the Riverside, then they started settling out in Fresno, Madera. That was one of the earliest places. It's still the biggest place. You see, almost 25% in 2007 were in that area. So it's a huge place. But in the around 2000, late 90s, 2000, started shifting to the coast. Greenville, where all the Triquis are. The Mixtecos went over for the strawberries. And so there's more on the coast now. And you can see that in the slide on the left, that Santa Maria, San Diego, Salinas, Ventura, and so forth on the coast where the people go, and you can see a division in 2007 between the areas. Central Coast is 45%, Central Valley 33%, and so forth. San Diego is still a big one, and the North Coast. Okay, next slide, please. So now, if you have time, I'm going to go through some slides from the COUGH survey, which is the COVID-19 farm worker survey, which we just did. And here at Silas, I'm going to use for Indigenous. I'm going to use if they did their interview in the Indigenous language. So I'm comparing that with the other people. So I figure about 85% of the others are non-Indigenous, would not identify as Indigenous, but I have no idea. We didn't ask them, so I don't know. Anyway, so this is a proxy. And you can see that the Indigenous are kind of disadvantaged in a series of ways in this COVID crisis. More of them go to emergency rooms, 43% against 29%. Few of them have private doctors. More use home remedies. You can see that on the slide, 6% versus 4%, 12% versus 3% private doctors. So there's a tendency for them to not to go to private doctors like the non-Indigenous and to use emergency rooms. Next slide, please. They're more blocked by cost, lack of information. About 1.5 times of them as the non-Indigenous say cost is a barrier for healthcare. They lack of information, 10% against 2%. So there's a lack of information. But 24% of the people say they could figure out a way to get some healthcare, but only 9% of the Indigenous. So they are certainly disadvantaged in this regard, according to our data. Next slide, please. They're also, this is an easy one, they're exposed to infection more. One of the things we found out is that people, especially in vans, are going with strangers to work. The Indigenous more so, 54% against 49% are going in vans. So they're more exposed to infection. Next slide, please. And also we found that both groups, they're increasing the number of people in their house after COVID. Instead of decreasing it, they're increasing it. 11% of the Indigenous have increased the number of people in their house against 5% of the non-Indigenous. They're another measure of being more exposed. Next slide, please. Also, I find this one very interesting. We asked a series of questions about training, and everybody says almost everybody says they got to talk. And a lot of people say they were given an information sheet, but only 1 out of 5 were explained in detail how they use the equipment. And among the Indigenous, that was almost nobody, 3%, whereas the non-Indigenous was 20%. So they're not, I question whether if you with these language challenged people, whether you give it a talk by the foreman in Spanish. I'm not sure how much he knows about COVID anyway, but if you give a talk in Spanish, how much is getting through to the Indigenous? They say that they were not trained in how to equipment, like 1/7 as much. Next slide, please.
Rick, can I ask, is the distinction there between talk and explain that the explained is more interactive?
No, we asked them, did you get a talk? Yes, I got a talk. Then, did somebody explain to you how to put on a mask, when to wear a mask? We're given a detailed explanation of how to use PEP. And most people said no. Thanks for that question, Victoria. Next slide. I'm almost finished. It's interesting that the Indigenous still protect themselves more. They lack healthcare information. They don't have as much health insurance. They travel more with strangers. They receive inferior training, but they wear masks more. And their colleagues, they say their colleagues are wearing masks more. 91% say they're wearing masks. Almost everybody says they wear a mask. It's actually, if your colleagues wear a mask, I think, which is the better measure. And because people have a different view of themselves than others. And And the indigenous say their colleagues are wearing masks more. So I think maybe the indigenous are more sensitive to the COVID and protecting themselves, maybe because they're more exposed. Next slide. So to summarize, the indigenous are a diverse but very different group than any other Mexican farmers, with their own culture, and they have survived. They suffer from more poverty and are more exposed to disease than the mestizos because of discrimination and history, and because they're more recently arrived. And they can contribute disproportionately more to the well-being of other Californians. And remember in the design of your programs, which it seems to be helping farm workers a lot, that if you remember how the farm workers are organized, they're very, very loyal to their hometown. And their hometown organization is, they know people from their hometown. And I think it's very important to remember that and how you design programs that reach them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. That was incredibly informative. I'd like to open up to my colleagues, the board members first, to see if they have any questions or comments.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for the presentation. That was very, very interesting and informative. I had just one question. Could you elaborate a little on why immigration changed after IRCA in the way that slide showed?
Oh, in 1986, there was from 86 to 88. Julia probably knows more of this than I do, but there was an amnesty program, a legalization program that legalized almost 1 million Mexican, mostly men, farm workers with the SAWS program, and so a lot of farm workers got legalized. I mean, close to 1 million nationally. Maybe a third, 300,000 or 400,000 in California. So a lot of them were, and they didn't since they came after 1986, they didn't benefit from that. So once you're in the system and you can get your relatives in, you become a citizen. You notice in that slide that the indigenous, almost nobody's a citizen, whereas the mestizos, I can't remember what it is, 10-15% are citizens. So the mestizo population started coming in the 20s, really heavily in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and the indigenous really started coming in the 70s and heavily in the 90s. So it's a much more recent population. So they're not institutionalized. They're not plugged in to our institutions because of discrimination by other Mexicans, because of language barriers, because of educational levels, because they come from very small places that they're not used to. A lot of mestizos come from big towns and neighborhoods and cities. Fewer, maybe 40 or 45% of the farm workers in California that are mestizos didn't even have an agricultural background in Mexico, whereas maybe 70% of the indigenous did. So it's a different population.
Richard, this is board member Cynthia Flores. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to follow up. So it appears to me that because there is a direct correlation with the authorization of work and the level of pay, therefore, because indigenous populations are less likely to be authorized to work, is there a direct relationship that makes them more likely to be exploited in the workforce, or even maybe less likely to speak up about wage theft or issues of that nature?
Yeah, that's a controversial issue, whether there's a direct correlation between undocumented status and wage. There's papers on both sides of that. I think that wages in general for farm workers don't go up that much. They're not that sensitive to experience, strangely enough. They go up somewhat, but the whole thing is very flat. And but yeah, also the language barriers are very important for indigenous, because when you're, especially piece rate, you come up to the crew boss he measures this 20 pounds or 15 buckets or whatever it is. He says, well, you got 14. I said, no, I got 15. Said, well, I can't understand. You don't speak Spanish. I can't understand you. And so I'm not going to give you 15 buckets. So I think there's quite a bit of, I wouldn't be underwhelmed by the racism in Mexico. Gaspar is going to talk about that. But the mestizo mayordomos, almost all mestizos. It's very few indigenous mayordomos. And their whole life they've been seeing these indigenous people being mocked on TV and radio, and so Gaspar can answer that question better.
The population, is it is there any data or any indication, is this population going back and forth across the border, or are they once they're here staying here, and are there kind of like second generation?
It's definitely second generation. Of the ones like San Miguel Cuevas, Santa Maria Tipos de Latón, where that came earlier in the 70s. There's a lot of second generation. There's a lot of variation within the networks, within the hometown networks. Most of them have come since the 90s, but some have came before. Those have a second generation. And those that have came earlier and qualified for documented status, they can go back and forth. But it's the very intrepid farm worker that's going back and forth across the border now. It's so expensive and dangerous. Border patrol in front of you and narcos behind you. It's a dangerous situation. So people are pretty much here, are staying here, and there's a trickle across, and people go back, because they have to, but people are avoiding it. I think it's still people are bringing their children up, of working age, 16-year-old boys, put them in the field. But I have to do it. Somebody's got to fund me to do an updated study to gather some of the current data. Maybe Gaspar has an idea.
That actually leads me to my next question. Is anecdotally, my understanding is that the general farm worker population is aging, and I wondered if that the indigenous farm worker population tracked that, or if we had any sense if there was any demographic difference.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the whole population in the NOS is around 38, and if you look about 10 years back, it probably would be 33, 34, something like that. And the indigenous population, which is about 3 or 4 years younger, would track it the same. If I could run that for you if you want to send me an email.
Okay.
I could track the indigenous population over time. The age over time.
Great. Any other questions from colleagues?
Yes, Chair Hasid, this is Itir Yakar, board member, board counsel with the ALRB. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative and helpful. I'm just curious if there's any training being done that you're aware of to address the discrimination, since it's such a prominent, widespread problem and it impacts wages, whether our sister agencies or whether the ALRB or the General Counsel's office, if anybody would like to respond. I'm curious about any training to address
it should be done, but Marissa and Gaspar are better positioned to answer that.
Okay, thank you.
It certainly should be done, and I think there's some interest in the grower community too in doing that.
Any other questions or public comment?
Yeah, this is Julie Montgomery. Hi, thanks you so much, Rick. I really appreciated your presentation. Very informative. Just a quick question, and I think it may be a little early to answer this. I'm not sure if we have the data yet, but I'm wondering, is there any data that speaks to the COVID infection rates of indigenous populations in the United States versus mestizo populations, like in the farm working communities? I'm curious if there's a difference.
I don't know. I mean, the survey, the cough survey, can't measure prevalence or it can't do that. I mean, the best data I think to measure farm worker is by zip code. And I did a study in Salinas in 2017, which I measured joint housing, people living with other families in a house by zip code. I did that in 2017. But I took the data from 2020 from the Monterey County zip code data where the COVIDs were, and there was a correlation between where the joint housing was among farm workers. But I think there is a correlation between this over. I think that it's got to be true from the one can deduce if they're traveling with people more to work with strangers, if they live in more crowded housing, you know, they are wearing masks more. That's good, but all farm workers are more exposed. Yeah, it's three, but the rate is probably 3 times as much as non-farm workers. But I don't know about indigenous.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are the indigenous languages related to one another so that different, you know, like they can't communicate with one another across their language group?
No, there's many variantes within each language. So Fausto Sanchez who's on this call, and I went to Tlaxiaco to do some interviewing. He couldn't talk to those people at all, 0. You know, so I think Gaspar should answer that. Gaspar, please help me out here.
I think this might be a good time to
right.
switch over to the second portion.
Yes, I think we will. So, and thank you, Rick, for starting the introduction of Gaspar Rivera Salgado, who's the project director for the UCLA Labor Center, and will be speaking about cultural competency as an integral factor to engage Indigenous farm workers. Gaspar, please take it away.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here. Thank you, Rick, for such a great presentation. Cynthia, do you mind if I share it from my screen? Thank you.
Santiago, would you mind providing Gaspar? There you go. Thank you.
Good, thanks. There were some interesting questions already, and I think some of those questions I'll be addressing in this presentation, but also Marisa will talk a lot about language. My main goal really is to highlight some of the findings that we had for a study that we did in 2018 for the Labor and Workforce Development Agency that incorporated a study of the communication strategies of a lot of the agencies, the departments and board. And what we did also is that based on this study, we developed a series of trainings. So we developed a training for agency staff, for advocates, and also for farm workers themselves. Our main goal was to really start thinking about this issue of becoming a learning organization for different agencies of the state to know the population and to really change practices. So once you get information such as the one that provided Rick, what do you do with that? How do you take that kind of information and start building your capacity to respond to the multiple challenges represented by a diverse workforce? So already Rick presented some of the challenges that it means to deal with a diverse workforce. So basically then, my hope is that I plant the seeds along with my colleagues, Rick Mines and Marisa, for transforming the Agricultural Labor Relations Board into a learning organization that can develop capacity and change practices. Already in the beginning, we heard reports from different folks, from different agencies in the state, and I'm so glad that, you know, already there's some very interesting models that we can develop. One of the challenges, though, is that, you know, the state is big and there are many agencies, but there's already good practices. So Sebastian mentioned these farm worker initiative. And I think one of the great practices that is being developed is they uploaded, they created a web page for indigenous farm workers. They reach out to a lot of community agencies that have developed the capacity, that are training interpreters and translators, and they uploaded actually some of the information on COVID-19 and other basic labor rights into their webpage. And it'd be great for you to go and look at it. And also you can start hearing the sound of these indigenous languages. There was one question about whether or not indigenous languages are mutually exclusive, or can people understand each other. What we should know is that when we talk about indigenous languages, such as Mixteco, Zapotec, and I'll go over that a little bit later, it would be better to think about family of languages. When we talk about Mixteco and we say, oh, these populations speak Mixteco, that's a misnomer, because that really hides the fact that Rick was pointed out. A lot of these Mixtecos come from villages in which they don't understand each other. So it's better to think about familiar languages, and that is key, because when you're trying to find a match for an interpreter, if you know where people come from, then you'd be better at finding a match. So this is a good practice that already the state is incorporating. So when they say Mixteco, they have all these different variations of Mixteco. And one of the most established Mixteco communities that in the Fresno, Madera area that Rick was referring to is San Miguel Cuevas. They've been around, for more than 40 years. There's a vibrant second generation. So our colleague here, Irma Luna, who used to work at CRLA and now works for Centro Binacional, she's one of a growing cadre of trilingual interpreters. She's fluent in English, Mixteco, and Spanish. So she comes from San Miguel Cueva. So she represents this new wave of second generation that is not losing their identity. It's actually, becoming the cutting edge of really becoming trilingual. My hope is that as we learn more about this population, we transform our practices, and hopefully the 1-800 numbers can multiply. And one of the ideas that I had is, why not create a 1-800 number Mixteco, Triqui, Zapotec, where indigenous people can call with a specific question, knowing that they could get access to specific information in their own language. Also, I can make available the full report where we study the communication practices of different agencies, and we took a sample available in the different websites from all the major agencies, especially the ALRB, CalOSHA, the Employment Department, and also other agencies. And we evaluated how effective they would convey key information to farm workers. And in general, we can say that there's a lot of work to be done. A lot of these communication strategy that we found in the website relies on written text. And so that's kind of the main way in which different agencies communicate important information. And that's a shortcoming. We also conducted focus groups with indigenous farm workers. And the main way they communicate is orally and through video. So there's already some very important initiatives that rely on that, such as the one that I just showed. Uploading sound and video is actually a better strategy, and to make that those information more interactive. And we can, if we have time, if you're interested, we can talk about that. My main goal right now is to really think of you all as decision makers, and how can we start reframing our narrative about the workforce, the farm worker workforce, and to start thinking about this workforce as multi-ethnic, multilingual. And then when you know about that, then what are the ways in which you can increase your capacity to respond to the multiple challenges that this population, the indigenous farm worker population faces. A full disclosure, a member of the Mixteco community. I was part of that, a massive exodus of Mixtecos who came to the United States in the mid-1980s, 1990s. So I'm deeply embedded in those community networks. But also, I have to say that, you know, this population keeps growing and keeps becoming more complex. So even members of that community, there's no way they can know everything about indigenous farm workers. So it is always great to work in collaboration with other state agencies, nonprofit organizations, academia, and also different communities. So one way in which we can think about the challenges of thinking about farm workers, and this is something at the core of Rick Mine's presentation, is how we think about farm workers and think about diversity, how we think about indigenous versus the mestizo or Hispanic Latino. And, you know, there's this huge debate even, what is the larger pan-ethnic label for this community? And even at the larger level, there's this debate between, are they Hispanics, are they Latino? And then what are indigenous communities? One key question is, why are we so concerned about indigenous Mexicans? How diverse is Mexico? How many languages are spoken in Mexico? I see some familiar faces in the Zoom call. So many of you have attended some of the cultural sensitivity workshops that we have organized with other nonprofit organizations, so you might know the answer, but that is a key question. Is Mexico a diverse country in terms of ethnicity and languages? And we'll go over the numbers. And how can we think about indigenous languages? Are there dialects? Because many times even the word in Spanish that people use to describe these indigenous languages are dialectos. And I have to tell you, you know, ahead of time that indigenous languages are languages, full communication systems. They're not variations of another language. We can talk about dialects within the familiar language of Mixteco, Zapotec, or Triqui. So one of the most prevalent narratives that really dominates our thinking about diversity within the farm worker population comes from really the census, how we think about diversity within the Latino Hispanic community. And basically the main sources of information that we have is the census. And as we can see here in this graph, this is a graph that illustrates the dramatic increase of migration from Mexico coming to the United States, especially starting in the 1980s, but booming steadily. So we're witnessing really a demographic revolution, the dramatic transformation of the labor workforce and the general population in the United States. And of course, look at this growth. It's exponential growth, actually. So according to the census, it is projected that in 2050, in 30 years, 28% of the US population will be of Latino Hispanic origin. And the way we think about diversity within this population is along the information, the data that comes from the census, which is along nationality. So if you're Hispanic Latino, you fill out the Hispanic Latino question, and then you state the country of origin where you are from. And then you have to fill out the racial question. You know, as you know, there are only very limited options for the racial question. And this is especially hard for indigenous Mexicans. You know, what are you? White, African-American, Native American, or Asian, Hawaiian, or Native Alaskan. There has been there's a campaign currently undertaken by a lot of nonprofit organizations that work with indigenous migrants, that they're encouraging all indigenous migrants from southern Mexico, also indigenous migrants from Guatemala, to state that they're Native American and that they can write their the pueblo of origin instead of the tribe to write it there. So hopefully we can see more people, and we can have some numbers about how many Mixtecos there are. And these will be especially good in California. This practice started in the census of 2000, and little by little, the people who have identified as Mixtecos, Zapotec has been increasing. But this year, there's a massive campaign with the census. Of course, things are a little bit complicated because of the COVID and you know, also the change in politics of the census. I'm going very fast because I have a lot of information to share. Should I go, Cynthia, to what time should I go?
Sorry, Gaspar. I think we could do until 12:10.
Okay.
Should be fine.
So let me go very quickly, and then maybe we can open it up for questions, and then also to allow Marisa to do her presentation, and maybe at the end we can come back with some questions from everyone. So just to test your knowledge of Latino Hispanic, who are these people are Latino Hispanic? So think about it. So of course the answer is obvious, all of them, right? Because Hispanic Latinos can be from any racial background. So we have here different people who would qualify as Latino Hispanics in the United States. And this is part of a training that we do on cultural sensitivity, trying to question these labels and opening up labels such as Latino Hispanic, but also the label of Mexicanness. So the same question would apply then to indigenous people from Mexico. So if you could take a guess about who are these people are indigenous, can you tell indigenous people just by looking at their faces? Is it a phenotypical issue? Is it a language issue? How can we tell who indigenous people are? And of course, the answer is that, all of these are Mixtecos. And so you can see the variety of faces, phenotypes. So you cannot tell just by looking at them who they are. And one of the key takeaways that I want you to really think about is how diverse linguistically and ethnically Mexico is. There are currently 70 indigenous groups in Mexico. Each one of them, as I mentioned, is speaking their own language. And actually, these are familiar languages. So there are many variations of these within each language. And as Rick mentioned, most of the indigenous languages are concentrated in what we call the southern corridor of Mexico in the states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. And this is Guatemala right here. And this is the Yucatan Peninsula. Actually, the two largest indigenous languages are the Nahuatl language, spoken by the Aztecs, which is spoken in central Mexico, and the Mayan Yucateco in the peninsula. But the state with the, and this is the list, and I can facilitate, of course, this PowerPoint so you can see all the different languages. But you can see that, and we'll go more into detail, the most diverse state in terms of ethnicities and languages is the state of Oaxaca, and we'll go over that. Most of this data comes from a recent census done in Mexico, the Mexican census. They changed the way they identify the population. The practice since the post-war years had been that really Mexico tried to minimize the size of indigenous population, and they would only count as indigenous the people who spoke an indigenous language. So when census takers would go to indigenous population, they would ask the question, not whether or not you identified as Mixteco, Zapotec, Triqui, but they would ask the question, do you speak an indigenous language at home? And if you were 5 years of older and you say yes, you would be counted as indigenous. But if you live in an indigenous community and you didn't speak the language, you were not counted as indigenous person. So for a long time, the number of officially indigenous population in Mexico was around 6-7%. In this 2015 census, those people who were asked whether or not they spoke an indigenous language at home hover around 6.6%. However, for the first time, the census allowed for self-identification, and it allowed people to say whether or not they would identify as indigenous, as an indigenous person. So this is interesting, and it will be a source of a lot of questions. So who's indigenous? We have here then that 25.6 million Mexicans out of a population of 120 million identified, self-identified as indigenous. This is 21.5% of the population. So there's a large debate about, well, which is the official indigenous population? Those who say, who self-identify, and this is completely free, nobody's forced, they can fill out the census. It's like the United States, you can, you're free to choose whatever identity you have, or those who speak an indigenous language. For us, it's important to realize how difficult it is to decide and label and impose these identities. I think I would go more for the self-identification, right? Well, you can identify whatever you are, but these are really interesting numbers because, as I mentioned before, if you see the rise of immigration to the United States since the mid-1980s, Mexican immigrants were driving that increase. Of course, there were immigrants from Central America, and we have, you know, a large population from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, but by far, close to 78% of the Hispanic Latino population is of Mexican origin. So these indigenous people were part of that massive migration arriving here. So from the very beginning, this Mexican origin population has been very diverse ethnically and linguistically. And of course, something that we need to realize is that Mexico is the most indigenous country in the Americas. In terms of sheer number of population, if we take the number of self-identification, Mexico would have the largest number of self-identified indigenous people in the Americas. In terms of percentage, of course, there are countries that are more indigenous than Mexico. Peru, Bolivia, Guatemala hover on the 50% of the population. And this is, we're interested about farm workers, and we're interested about their communities of origin. And I think this is a map that shows the linguistic diversity of Oaxaca. So there are 16 indigenous languages spoken in Oaxaca. A lot of them, we have some of them we have very small numbers, but the top 3 languages spoken among farm workers in California are Zapotec, Mixtec, and Triqui. So we might find, of course, Chatino migrants, Mije migrants, more and more, but it would be a very good guess to say that, you know, especially Mixteco, Triqui, and Zapotecs are the most prevalent languages in California. And let me just see if I can play this very short video about one of the challenges that we're speaking. And this is framing the issue that Marisa will elaborate more in her presentation. And this is that there are many challenges, both internal and externals, in dealing with indigenous migrants. Of course, indigenous migrants, we can define them as the descendants of the populations that were in Mesoamerica before the arrival of the Spaniards. So when we hear their languages, we're hearing those ancient languages that were here before the Spaniards arrived here. And throughout the history, there have endured a lot of racism and discrimination. We have to acknowledge that there is a racial hierarchy in Mexico, and indigenous people are at the bottom of that racial hierarchy. And this is translated into everyday practices from the general mestizo population, from the general Mexican population. They come to the United States already with preconceived ideas about race and ethnicity. And something to think about is that, for example, the Latino Hispanic community in California, most of them, a majority of them, choose the white as their racial identity. So one has to ponder, is it because there's no other choice, or is this because that's a sign of a racial aspiration? But what we need to really realize is that this racism is translated into the fields, is translated into schools, but also is translated into the structure of the system. So if we have bilingual staff in agencies, in hospitals, who assume that everybody from Mexico speaks Spanish, what would happen if somebody who looks Mexican, who does not speak Spanish, shows to the room? And this is an example of what could happen if you fail to speak Spanish. So let me play this video of a tricky speaker and her experience with the healthcare system in the Salinas, Monterrey area. Can you hear the sound?
We cannot.
You might? Okay.
So just the presentation is much larger, of course, the PowerPoint presentation that I have for you. I'm gonna make it available, and there's a lot more information here. But just another issue also is the issue of structural racism. There has been quite a lot of debate in Mexico about whether or not Mexico is inherently a racist society, especially because of its treatments of the indigenous population. And it's interesting that it's a debate. I mean, some people really question the fact that Mexicans can be racist, right? I mean, after all, the general narrative is that Mexico is the result of a mixing of many different races, the European, the Spaniards, and the indigenous population, and also the substantial presence of Afro-Mexicans, and therefore the result is this multiracial society, which is mixed at its heart. But according to recent reports, different studies, Mexico also is having a reckoning with this racial past. And I think that a lot of the things that we see, especially here in the reports, this racial hierarchy is translated into the workplaces in California, and especially in the field. So it's not just about, small issues. Some people said microaggressions are too small to be considered, a bigger problem, but microaggressions, when they're repeated in the accumulation of those microaggressions, and when they're embedded in a structural power, they can really have a tremendous result. And Read Minds was highlighting, for example, the wage differential between indigenous people and mestizo farm workers. I would argue that that wage differential is not only because indigenous people have less skills or are new arrivals, but actually is the result of this racial hierarchy operating at all levels in at the workplace. So we need to really pay attention to that and move from an analysis not only of individual experiences, but to an analysis of structural practices that really lead to this wage differential. For those of you who speak Spanish in the call, I don't know how many of you were able to understand the tricky speaker that was in the video. So that's the other also myth, right? That some people say, well, if I speak slow Spanish, they will understand me. And so I bet that if we slow down the video, when the woman, the farm worker is speaking tricky, even if you speak Spanish, you would not be able to understand her. So those are different languages. And sometimes, we don't realize that. And I've seen over and over interactions with indigenous migrants that reflect a lot of the interactions of English speakers with non-English speakers. People tend to shout, people tend to talk with their hands in the hope that they can communicate, and it's the same thing with indigenous folks. So we have to really overcome not only this idea of structural practices that produce a different outcome, but also we need to train our staff about inherited discriminatory practices, and especially this is true for people of Mexican origin. There's a lot of embedded racism and prejudice that has been translated actually into our everyday language. So even, if you speak Spanish and you travel to Mexico, if you want to insult somebody, all you have to say is, no seas indio. And that's actually a pejorative phrase. Don't be an Indian. That means don't be uneducated. Don't be somebody without a culture. So it just tells you how this vision of indigenous people is really part and parcel of mainstream cultural ideology in Mexico. So I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions. And I'm hoping that I'm setting up the context for Marisa's presentation about how to develop good practices about finding a good interpreter. And I think that'd be good. And then I'll make this presentation available to you all just to see if you have, so you can read it at your own pace. But I'm gonna stop here just to see if you have any questions that we can discuss. Go ahead.
Barry, I think you're on mute still.
Thank you for pointing that out. I got pretty far before you said something. Anyway, I'm thinking about training of farm workers, and that a lot of training is in written materials. That's how we set the whole thing up frequently. So my question about indigenous people who speak these indigenous languages is, one, are they written? And two, are people literate in them if they are?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. Most of these languages have recently been written. In general, one has to assume that these languages are orally. Most of the farm worker population have, between 3 and 4 year education. And most of these indigenous people whose primary language is indigenous, they never learn how to write it, because in Mexico, the public education system does not teach you. There's not a single bilingual program that would teach you how to write your own language. Most of the bilingual education in Mexico is what we call assimilation programs. They teach you how to speak Spanish, but they don't teach you how to write in your own languages. So no, most of the people, and this is interesting because we did some focus groups among farm workers, and we asked them this specific question. How do you get information about your rights in California? How do you find out what is the minimum wage? How do you find out where to go if you get injured? And to me, it was surprising. They communicate a lot with this app called WhatsApp, and they exchange a lot of videos, messages. They're very active on Facebook. They communicate with their hometowns. So the activity that they do is mostly orally and visual. And I think that would be a good practice. Most of the most effective materials coming from different state agencies are in the form of videos. So there's a wonderful training about the use of pesticides, for example, that has been translated into Mixteco, into Triqui, into Zapotec, and people watch that, and we screen those materials, and people thought they were very attractive. They were done using farm workers as the actors, and people thought that, you know, they were very effective. They wish they would be in a smaller format, shorter format, so they can be uploaded and easily share via Facebook and via WhatsApp application where they can share these materials. Also, we have to point out that the oral tradition is well and alive to the point where we have indigenous radio programs in California. Radio Bilingüe has a vibrant La Hora Mixteca every Sunday, and they have incorporated all their languages, and there's Radio Indígena in Oxnard. So just the fact that these languages are oral has not impeded these communities to communicate. But one has to assume that in the short term, the most effective way to communicate with this population is orally and visually.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Silas.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Thank you for your presentation, Gaspar. And maybe with this question, I may be inviting you to do a whole another presentation some other time. But I'm thinking about one of the last points in Rick Mines' slide, which was talking about how the hometown networks and the tradition of community involvement that really emphasizes how everybody has an important role to play is, you know, a source of strength in many ways, and allows, you know, indigenous communities to defend themselves and advocate for themselves. And I think apart from the important issues of language access, appropriate translation, and having, you know, materials and formats that people can access, I kind of wonder if you have any thoughts on how the labor law, the you know, rights around protected activities and unionization, you know, can be communicated in a way that resonates more with that experience, you know, of these networks. And I think, you know, in agriculture, indigenous workers have been some of the most active in exercising these rights, whether or not they know about the ALRA, but people have, you know, tight-knit communities, and they've gone on strike and, you know, engaged in a lot of activities together to support themselves. And I wonder if there are some kind of lessons that we need to think about in terms of how we, you know, communicate in a more culturally appropriate, you know, way. What, you know, we have a tradition of individual rights that sometimes may not resonate as well with groups that think more collectively, but, you know, I wonder if there are any implications, you know, for thinking about that.
Thank you, Silas. I think that's a very important question that goes to one of the best strategies also to deal with indigenous communities. I think that the way you're putting it, Silas, is to really reframe our relationship and how we think about indigenous migrant communities, and going from a deficit perspective, what do they need, what do they lack, to an asset perspective, how can we collaborate? And I think that's a massive change of mind, because many times agencies and staff approach these people from the deficit perspective, here they are, they're begging for money. They don't know anything. They don't know where to go. So I'm here imparting knowledge. And many times we forget that in collaborations, in fostering partnership, there's a lot of strength. So how can a staff think, okay, I'm in Fresno. How can I engage with the vast network of hometown associations, community organizations, cultural organizations as the venue to spread the word? We ask indigenous farm workers to in these focus groups to identify state agencies that are important for them. They could not identify a single agency by their full name. The only agency that rose to the top, and I don't know, and of course, and everybody here knows that they could name La Ley Laboral as the only agency that most of these workers could name. But it wasn't, the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. It was La Ley Laboral. It's interesting that, why is that? Why, very important agencies that are there to guarantee basic access, basic rights to these farm worker communities are, they couldn't name them. And I think, so who has the responsibility to reach out? And I think this is another change in your framing, right? Are state agencies also educators about rights? Who educates? Who reaches out to communities? Are the advocates the only ones who should educate the larger community? Should workers themselves find on their own who does what? And I think if we reframe this, the way you're framing it, Silas, is, okay, well, how can we develop more collaborations? And this assumes also that your staff knows that these networks exist. Your staff, it assumes that your staff knows what community-based organizations are there, when do they have their activities, whether or not, for example, we went to two community-based organizations, one in Fresno and one in Oxnard, and we checked their offices to see if they had any material from state agencies that they could distribute. None of these offices had any important material to distribute. So despite the fact that they serve farm worker communities, and we had actually another focus group with advocates, and we asked them about the relationship with the state agencies. And in general, they had a very conflictive view of state agencies. And overall, they say they're not responsive, and it's very difficult to navigate the bureaucracy. So we have a big challenge. If farm workers cannot identify the state agencies, if advocates are saying that they don't know who the representatives of the different agencies are in Fresno or in Oxnard, and these are very prominent community-based organizations, we're in big trouble. How can we then be more proactive? And of course, there's always a caveat. This is a political process. Hometown associations, social networks, we need to handle them with care. On the one hand, they're very good assets in terms of knowing who they are, but also, a lot of these networks are very male-dominated, dominated by adults. So we need to take that into consideration too. And also the fact that, especially for the younger generation, they have formed their own networks, and they're active not only within their hometown associations, but they're active within the immigrant advocacy networks, youth groups, undocumented networks. So I think that we need to really prepare people who are sophisticated and who have a sophisticated knowledge of the community. And that only comes through time. I mean, you cannot acquire that with one training, right? It's a practice that you evaluate and that you convene and that you build over time. So there's more about this, and I think we need to, we can talk about more about the caveats of working with hometown associations. And I'm thinking about the Triqui community, especially in the Greenfield area. Triqui, one part of the Triqui community, especially coming from Juan Copala, they're basically political refugees. They've been fleeing a lot of political violence that is taking place within their community. There are different armed groups within that community. So that community has been displaced by violence to local Mixteco communities. They're fleeing to northern Mexico and they're fleeing to Greenfield. So their experience would be a little bit different than the experience of Mixtecos from San Miguel Cuevas, who have a very sophisticated, established, not only one hometown association, they have many committees. Just to end this comment, they have a committee called El Comité de los Muertitos. So this is a list of volunteers who, every time somebody passes away, they want to send the body home to Oaxaca, but it costs between $5,000 to $10,000. So it's not cheap. So they have a list of close to 300 individuals who, at the drop of a hat, that network is activated if somebody passes away. They contribute between $50 to $150, and they're able to get about $12,000 to donate to the family to send that body home. And this is one subset of it's not the Hometown Association. They have a Comité de Pueblo, which is the one that interacts with the hometown. They have a sports committee, and you have many trilingual people within that. So you have the contrast of some folks like the Triques who really are fleeing violence. And when you tell them, hey, do you have a hometown association? They're very wary to even discuss that, right? Because their relationship with the hometown is very conflicted. And you have the opposite, where people from San Miguel Cuevas say, okay, what committee are you talking about? We have so many. So, you know, how can we communicate this knowledge, these assets to staff of different agencies? So agencies have this knowledge, but not all of it. So we need to start centralizing this knowledge so that it can be accessed to different staff.
Thank you so much, Gaspar. Really appreciate it. I think we do want to make sure we get to Marissa as well. And so with that, Marissa, if you could share with us your presentation. I think you're still on mute.
I'm so sorry. I went into presentation mode and then the control screen for unmuting disappeared. About how long do I have here?
I think about 20 minutes to a half hour. We would like to try and wrap the meeting by 1 o'clock, and we do.
Sure. Okay. I'll try to go through as quickly as I can then. And do you have my presentation on the screen?
We do. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. So I'll go ahead and start off and introduce myself. I'm Marisa Landin. I've been with CRLA for about 7 years, and I've been in the role of the program director over the Indigenous program for 3 years. So I have learned a lot in the last 3 years. I've made some mistakes, and I love talking about what I have learned, what I'm continuing to learn, because I want to model that you don't have to be an expert to serve Indigenous communities. I think sometimes it can be overwhelming to hear this amount of new information, and it can create a sense of urgency that, the only way we're going to be able to serve this very diverse, wonderful group of people is if we can become complete experts that rival Rick and Gaspar's level of knowledge. And I'm here to tell you that you don't need to be an expert because Indigenous people are experts in their own communities. All that we need to do is be humble and willing to work hard and adapt as we strive to better serve them. So I don't know if anyone was just feeling overwhelmed. I just wanted to share that information. So in being mindful of time, I'm going to just kind of skip around my presentation a little bit. More or less what I'm going to be talking about today is providing trained, qualified Indigenous language interpreters. We'll touch on how to identify them and then some of the challenges working with Indigenous interpreters where the infrastructure is not fully built up in California the same way that they would be for like picking up the phone and requesting a Spanish language interpreter. I'm also going to talk briefly about the issues that we see in our office that affect Indigenous farm workers. I apologize, some of our transitions are going to be very quick and awkward because this is adapted from like a half-day curriculum. And I know we're a little time pressed now, so we're going to be all over the place, but I'm going to try and make sure that there's some logical continuity. So, brief overview, CRLA was established in 1966. I'm sure most of you are aware of who we are. We have this identity, a very farm worker focused identity, legal aid for farm workers. We established the Indigenous program in 1993, so it only took us like 30 years to realize that we were underserving Indigenous communities. And now here we are 30 years later, and we are still constantly looking for ways to improve our services and build relationships and trust with the different Indigenous communities in our service area. So my office is in Arvin. I see a few of my coworkers on the call, so I just wanted to give a shout out to them. We are unique in that we're the only office in CRLA. We are exclusively a program. So all 5 of us in the office are focusing on serving Indigenous communities all day, every day, nights, weekends. We are living and breathing this topic. So we do a combination of direct services, impact litigation, educational outreach, know your rights. So all of these topics you're bringing up, all of the challenges that you've identified, we're thinking through them daily. How do we get outreach materials out if we know that the target population we want to reach is not going to be able to read the majority of those materials? What are some innovative ways we can connect? COVID has been just a real special challenge because so much of our outreach efforts were focused on that interpersonal connection. So it has been challenging, but not insurmountable. We're mostly focused on labor and employment, and we also provide some support for our 17 field offices. So let's just dive right in here with language access versus language justice. So you've probably heard this quote before, and I don't know who can be credited for saying it originally, but I most recently heard Dolores Huerta say this, that if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And I love that quote, and I love the imagery that it brings up. For me, it really illustrates this contrast between language access and language justice. So I'm going to beat this metaphor to death, but when I think about language access, I think about inviting somebody to my house for dinner and locking them out before they have a chance to walk in the front door, but leaving the curtains open. So they can peer in through the window and they can see what we're eating. And if they shout loud enough, we might be able to hear them. And if we speak loudly enough, they might be able to hear what we're saying. But they're not really participating, they're catching the gist, and they're not really feeling like an honored guest. When I think of language justice, I think of inviting somebody to dinner, inviting them into the house to have a seat at the table. We're dining on the same food, we're engaged in the same conversation, we're exchanging ideas, we're building a relationship. When I think of language justice, I know that my guests are not on the menu. So language is power. It's very easy to exploit someone who's unable to communicate their mistreatment. So let's look at these definitions. We have these very dry definitions that I pulled from somewhere in the legal materials that we'll go over later about what the legal obligation is to provide language justice, language access. So for language access, we have this ability for people who are limited English proficient to access programs or services of an agency or organization. And LEP, which is a term you'll hear a lot as well, is defined as a person who doesn't speak English as their primary language and has a limited ability to speak, read, write, or understand English. So we're really just kind of focusing on access, but there's not much of a discussion or thought about the quality of that access, the quality of the experience, and it's a little bit more about checking the box. So CRLA is really embracing a model of language justice. We have a language justice program now. We are training interpreters. We have a curriculum that we have built, and we're really trying to advance this where you focus more on the fundamental right to communicate. So if we look at these definitions, we have the right everyone has to communicate, to understand, and be understood in our languages. It's a commitment to creating spaces where no one language dominates over any other, a commitment to facilitating equitable cross-language communication, and just fundamentally a respect for everyone's language rights. And when it's not like you could go through and like, here's your language justice model and there's a prescribed list of things you can do. It's more of a guiding principle. And it's something that's helped me because it's very tempting, especially we're all very busy. We are all under-resourced. It's very easy to focus on the convenience part of extending language access. What is going to be easiest and cheapest to accomplish the goal? And when I use language justice as a guiding principle, I'm focused more on what is the outcome, and I'm focused more on the individual sitting across from me and whether or not I've truly connected with them and have been able to be heard and hear what they're telling me. So I'm going to jump around here a little bit because some things came up in questions to Gaspar and Rick's presentation that I wanted to touch on. And that is, we talked about the diversity of indigenous languages, and there it is breathtaking diversity. We've talked about how it's not a dialect, and I want to expand a little bit on that concept of dialect. Saying that Mixteco is a dialect, the implication is that it's a dialect of Spanish. And so that's offensive and inaccurate. It's like saying that Navajo is a dialect of English. And when we know in this country the history of persecution and oppression against Native Americans, to claim that their languages that predated English are subordinate to English or a lesser version or a minor variation of English, it's really offensive. So a lot of people, a lot of indigenous language speakers still refer to their own languages as dialects. And that might be the only word they were ever exposed to communicate to outsiders that they speak this other language. So we say languages when we mean languages. So Mixteco is a language, Triqui is a language, Zapoteco is a language. Within Mixteco, you have 84 variations. Some of those languages have no linguistic similarity whatsoever within each other. So when Gaspar was talking about a family of languages, that is accurate. Some, it might be that there's just a few words that are different, but other variations of Mixteco, you will need completely different interpreters and no one will be able to understand. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and like, how are we ever going to accomplish this? There's so many interpreters, where will we begin? I want to reassure you that in most service areas, you're not going to really see more than 5 to 7 various indigenous communities because people do migrate in community and people seek out that community structure. So I think that in larger areas where we have denser populations of indigenous communities, it is possible you're going to see a little bit more, but you're not going to need 84 interpreters in one day. I promise you that. I will personally pay for them if you would have the need for 84 interpreters in one day. So, okay, so next awkward transition now. Let's jump over to employment. So these are some of the issues that we see in our ARVN office and statewide that come up for indigenous farm workers. So trainings are given in a language that they don't understand. There's safety trainings, know your rights trainings. There's really targeted, vicious anti-indigenous bias that plays out in the workplace. This discrimination that's based on national origin. And I'll tell you a dynamic that we frequently see in farm work, which is we have a crew, like an indigenous crew, and then you have a mestizo, non-indigenous foreperson, who is relentlessly discriminating against the indigenous crew. And then, for example, within like the vineyards in Northern California, you might have a supervisor who has absolutely no awareness or is very willfully ignorant to that dynamic. And they're thinking, well, how can a Mexican discriminate against a Mexican? And they're not seeing that form of persecution that's going on. And if you're in that indigenous crew, the only way that you have of elevating your complaint and going up the proper channels is to use your foreman as an interpreter. And so you might be navigating and trying to explain the abuse you're experiencing in a language you don't speak fluently through your oppressor to the person above them. So I can't emphasize enough just how isolated a lot of the experiences are for indigenous communities. So people are harassed and bullied for speaking their language at work. There's a lot of suspicion and paranoia if a group of indigenous language speakers are speaking amongst themselves. We've seen bans, wholesale bans on speaking. You cannot speak your language anywhere on work property, not during breaks, not during lunch. That's illegal. The same wage theft, meal and rest violations, not provided tools. Anecdotally, we see that higher among indigenous communities. They're seen as less savvy, less able to assert their rights. And it's true because a lot of the agencies where they would go and complain about that don't provide interpreters in their languages, so they're just unable to make the complaint. Less likely to complain because of these communication barriers and fear, lack of access to transportation that Rick covered, generally given these more difficult, less desirable work assignments. And this last point, the racist myths that persist that justify it. I've personally heard this 8 or 9 times in the 3 years I've been here, where someone is explaining to me why these conditions persist for Indigenous workers, and they're explaining it to me like, I don't understand. They're like, no, you don't understand. Like, their bodies are built for this type of labor. They don't feel pain. And it's incredibly dehumanizing and immoral. And anytime you're claiming that an ethnic group doesn't feel pain based on their ethnic identity, I think is an indication that you have lost your path in life. So let's talk a little bit more about these barriers to receiving services. Obviously, we have linguistic barriers. We also have cultural barriers. There's this really specific dichotomy that we have identified where there's invisibility among some service providers and then that targeted discrimination among others. So that can manifest in a couple different ways. But I'll use, for example, DFEH. You know, when we draft a DFEH complaint about a form of discrimination that an Indigenous client has experienced, I know that overwhelmingly the likelihood is that the investigator doesn't have any cultural framework or context for the types of terminology or the stereotypes that have been and specific words that were used against the client. So it's not going to have the same like oomph. It's not going to have the same impact. So if I was drafting a complaint for a Black client and I said they were called the N-word in the workplace, that has an immediate significance. The investigator knows how harmful that is. They know that's a slur. They know it is offensive and that it's harassment. With Indigenous clients, if I say they were called Indio, it said that they were, there were comments about their short stature, dark hair. Somebody might not be like, well, why, that's not really, maybe that's bullying behavior, but that's not race-based, that's not tied to national origin. So not only are they experiencing this very identity-based discrimination, but then there's invisibility when they try to complain about it or have their complaint heard. So fear of consequences of the public charge rule, just a misunderstanding, and a lot of myths persist within the community about how expansive that is. Distrust of public agencies or programs, that stems from the very systemic racism in institutionalized racism in Mexico. And then this common practice of keeping your head down and don't complain. So a little deeper dive into the linguistic and cultural barriers. We see some heightened linguistic and cultural barriers for women and elderly people. Of course, none of this is 100% of the time. I've also had female Indigenous clients who were leading the charge and were, absolutely ruling everybody in the workplace because they knew their rights and they knew exactly how to assert them. So just a reminder that, none of these comments that we're making apply to every single person. We're talking about an incredibly diverse group of people. We tend to see men that are more commonly heads of household hold positions of prominence within the community. So Indigenous languages that are very diverse and poorly understood. And as a result of that, it's not as easy to pick up the phone and call Language Line or ComGap, any of these telephonic interpreter systems and say, hey, I need an Mixteco interpreter. First of all, that's not enough specific information. And second, they're not really trained, and we see high rates of mismatches between the interpreters they try to provide. And then let me skip over cultural practices for now, just based on time here. So it's overwhelming, and it's human nature that if you speak Spanish and the person in front of you is nodding at some of the words of Spanish you're speaking and speaking a few words of Spanish, you really want to believe that that's okay and that you're understanding each other. And I've seen wonderful people just charge forward like a bull in a china shop where we're going, they don't get you. And they're like, no, they get me, they get me. We are both speaking Spanish. And it's like, I promise you that and then, we waste hours. And then at the end they go, I don't think they understood me. And we're just going, right, that's what we tried to say from the beginning. So it does cost money to hire an Indigenous interpreter. It requires advanced planning and training and it's effort. And it is absolutely worth it. It is cost effective. And I say this from personal experience, the cost of re-interviewing somebody just the staff time, the cost of proceeding when you've made a mistake, I mean, for us, like a malpractice risk of going forward with the wrong facts because we didn't take the time to hire the interpreter. And, you know, lastly, we have the same legal obligation that other agencies and service providers do to provide language access to the communities we serve. So the risks of proceeding in Spanish, especially where you are trying to gather evidence for a fact-based narrative, is that you run the risk of creating an inconsistent narrative at no fault of the person you're interviewing. So if they're stumbling through and they don't understand the word you're using and they're saying yes and agreeing to something, you're going to write that down as a fact. And if the second time someone talks to them, they, you know, say something different because they never understood that word, it looks like their narrative has changed. And the narrative hasn't changed, but the language has just never been strong enough to be able to pull out that consistent narrative. I will also say that this is something to keep in the back of your mind anytime you use an interpreter. Interpreters use different words, and they aren't 100% perfect. So there are times that a misinterpretation, a mistranslation can give rise to the appearance of an inconsistent narrative when in fact it's more of a language barrier issue. So we see this some, I'm not trying to put like OSHA on blast or anything, but I've spoken with some of the OSHA investigators, and you know, they've said that they'll go and speak to people in the workplace who share a language with the investigator, who was a field, you know, the field agent who's going out and investigating workplace abuses. You're most likely speaking to the person who has the most power in that situation. If you're only going to speak to someone who's bilingual in English and Spanish, you're going to be talking to someone who's probably least likely to have experienced the harmful conditions. So when you are, if you're not connecting and speaking with the people who speak less commonly spoken languages, you're missing an opportunity to gather the real story. So the convergence of cultural and linguistic barriers, painting a false picture of understanding. This, what I mean by this is that, and I've experienced this too, Indigenous people show a tremendous amount of respect to people in authority. They're, in my, not everyone, of course, but you know, I see a pattern of people being very unwilling to correct me or disagree with me. So I have to be very careful in the way I ask questions, because if I say, okay, so you went in on Tuesday, right? They're going to say yes, because they don't want to disagree with me to be rude. So you have to be mindful of the way you're framing your questions and be mindful of the power that you bring into the room. You know, a classic example that people say is that, you know, a sign of respect in some Indigenous communities is to avoid eye contact. And that's a way of showing that they respect you, you know, is to not make eye contact. You know, in our culture, we see that as a sign of dishonesty. Somebody's not able to look you in the eye, they're probably not telling you the truth. And I've personally been in a situation where I was watching a law enforcement officer interview a sexual assault victim, and I saw him writing down notes about her not looking at him. And at the end of the interview, I said, you know, she's showing you respect by avoiding eye contact with you. Oh, and that was like this big thing for him. And it was such an afterthought to even make the comment. And it opened my eyes to how much those little moments can impact your assessment of somebody's credibility. So I'll skip over the client story for now too. I just want to make sure we have time. So everything we've talked about is sort of like the moral, for lack of a better word, like it's the right thing to do. We want to communicate, connect to a group of vulnerable workers. It's also the law. So I have both Title VI and Government Code 11135 up here. Title VI applies if you receive federal funding, and if you don't receive federal funding, if you're just state funded, it's still a useful law to dig into, because a lot of the precedent and analysis will likely be applied in how 11135 complaints are analyzed. The regulations for those are still currently being developed, but we anticipate that they will track Title VI and that will go a little bit further in their mandates. More people are familiar, surprisingly to me, with Daimali Alatorre than 11135 or Title VI, even though Daimali Alatorre doesn't really offer the same protections and is a little bit of a strange outlier of a law, in that it doesn't really have teeth, and I don't think that it really does much to protect people who don't speak English fluently. So, oh, and Jen, sorry if I didn't, but the requirement for extending language services is rooted in the prohibition of discrimination based on national origin. So language is a proxy for national origin. I won't go too deep into this, but the basic parameters of the legal requirements is to come up with a written language access plan, to have somebody appointed who is can train staff on the plan. You need to be researching what the language needs of your community are and come up with like a concrete plan of how you'll meet those language needs. I'm including this little nerdy thing at the bottom here, defining interpretation and translation. So it too can ruin your life, like it's ruined my life, because you will notice this misused everywhere. You can just like watch it on the news and think, oh, they're using it wrong. So interpreting refers to converting spoken messages, and translation is written messages. So if you say we need a translator, what you're really asking for is someone who's going to sit down and then write by hand or type out a difference. But if you're talking about oral language, we're talking about an interpreter. So let's talk about hiring the interpreter. So if you call an interpreter agency and you say, we need an interpreter from Oaxaca, they're going to giggle at you, because that's sort of like saying we need an interpreter from Europe. It's just incredibly imprecise, and it could be any one of many different languages. So I've given you a little cheat sheet here. Down at the bottom, state, and at the bottom you can put your country, are as broad. So we're going from most specific to broadest. So let's start with, we'll start with the languages of my coworker on the phone here. So we start from the person in front of me speaks, is from Mexico, the state of Oaxaca, Oaxaca district, the municipality of San Juan Mixtepec, and then the town, which, there's the town, we find that you don't necessarily have to have the town. So long as you can get to municipality, you have a pretty good chance of matching the languages. And the reason you need that geographic information is because of the diversity of the languages. And it's a very interesting historical reason for that, which we don't have time to get into, and I will not get into it. But it's not 100% match, but that's the best way. So then you get an interpreter on the phone who has that region match, who might say, you know what, that's not my municipality, but I've matched with people in the past. And you're going to need them to do a variant check. You need them to talk ahead of time before you plan everything out to make sure they really do understand each other, because people move. They might have given you their hometown, but they've only been in that hometown for one generation. And really the majority of people who speak their variant are from a different hometown. So it's important to double check and make sure you have the right information. So here are some better practices. I'm not going to say best practices, because all the time we were going, that did not work on something that we tried, and we're realizing that we need to reevaluate our own approach to something. So I'll go through here and I've got one more slide, and then I'll pause for questions. It's helped to proactively get to know the Indigenous communities in your service area, and you can use local CBOs. I will manage your expectations and say that a lot of CBOs are struggling to do this effectively as well. So it's not just like if you're cool and you're down and you're part of a CBO, you have this knowledge magically. It's a group of people that are being underserved across the board. So you have to seek out maybe specifically Indigenous focused organizations to gather this information. Make sure that the community knows that your agency serves Indigenous communities. And a lot of this, I know you're thinking, of course we do. And of course we would never turn away anyone because of the languages they spoke, but you have to be mindful and evaluate those subtle messages you're sending. If you say, can you come back with someone who speaks Spanish? Can you come back with bring someone who speaks English? You're sending a message that you're not welcome here to the person that you're serving. So making announcements when you do a presentation, we provide Indigenous language interpreters. We provide interpreters who speak languages like Mixteco, Zapoteco, Triqui. Not all Indigenous people use the word Indigenous to describe themselves. So that's why we like to say things like, do you speak another language like Mixteco, Zapoteco, Triqui, and give people multiple ways to capture that identity. Gaspar mentioned the radio ads on Indigenous language radio stations are very effective for us. Taking outreach materials that Indigenous communities can identify with. We have adopted, some outreach brochures that have like Indigenous art and things that somebody might see and think, okay, this is targeted to me. Avoiding the use of the word dialect or never saying Indian or Indio in Spanish. Recruiting employees and outreach workers who come from Indigenous communities. That's really key and important. Attending cultural events such as the Guelaguetza and other significant events, so that you will you will tap into that hometown network and meet very large groups of people all at once. And it's a good opportunity to build relationships with the community leaders, committing to honoring their language needs, being respectful of cultural differences, not making assumptions. And this is the double-edged sword of an insular community. Gaspar talked about this asset deficit model, and it's very true. There's some beautiful, amazing strength. Like, this isn't a problem that we have people who speak various languages living in California. That's tremendous. The fact that these languages have survived after targeted attempts to eradicate them off the face of the earth is amazing. And we should do everything we can to continue to preserve that and give people the right to communicate in their languages and retain these distinct cultural traditions. So, but as a result of all the outside interference and oppression, Indigenous communities are very insular. Everyone really relies on each other for support. And so it goes both ways. If you have a good experience with one person in the community, that's going to travel widely, and they're going to go, that's a trustworthy office. You can trust the people there, you're safe there. But then the opposite is true too. If they have a bad experience, that can kind of become the dominant narrative. If none of your outreach efforts are getting through, and the only story that's going on about ALRB is a bad experience someone had, that becomes the dominant narrative in the community. So it's both a good thing when things go well, but it's something to be mindful. It's something I stay up at night and think of, like, oh, got to give tough news to a client. Are we going to lose access to that entire community now? I won't go through these. These are just some ideas, mostly tracking the legal mandates in Title VI for next steps. I know this can be overwhelming. You might have some different ideas or disagree with some of the contents, and that's really, an internal discussion for you about what your next steps can look like. But I just wanted to share some of the things that have been successful for us in improving our services to Indigenous language speakers. Okay. Oh, and then a couple random things I'm going to shoehorn here in the end, just because I wanted to make sure I got a chance. Mixteco alto, Mixteco bajo, that's something that we're trying to get away from, using those distinctions, just because we've found high rates of mismatching variants when we use those. So Mixteco alto could cover many different languages. Same thing with Mixteco bajo. Some speakers from the same community say, no, we speak Mixteco alto, no, we speak Mixteco bajo. So we try to stay away from that. We just say Mixteco de, Mixtec from, and then the region in Mexico. And I think that's it. And I'll probably randomly shoehorn some other things in there, but I'll pause and see if anyone has any questions.
Victoria, I do want to say thank you, and thank you for that last part, because I had not heard that. There were other things in your presentation that were new to me too, but I do appreciate you shoehorning that in, and I apologize that you felt a little rushed here at the end. I'd like to open up to questions from my colleagues.
Hi, this is Santiago. I have two questions from staff, one from Ed Haas. Ed, you can unmute and ask your question. He'll be followed by Ana Marie Argumedo.
Okay, I just wanted to see if you could maybe comment a little more on this, because I'm aware that translation interpretation, you can't do literally because there are cultural differences. So cultural references in your communication wouldn't resonate with a person. So you have to take cultural context into account. And I wondered if you had some pointers to give to people just in general on that area.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that is true. I recently saw something that, a public health message, I forget where it was from, where it was comparing, it was saying that, socially distanced, the length of skis, 6 feet is the length of skis. And I mean, I've never seen skis in my entire life. I'm a, relatively successful person, and I could not tell you how long skis are. So I do think that those cultural meanings sneak in outreach materials in a way that you don't realize. And I think the best way to make sure is to work with a focus group. Identify a group of people, build a relationship who'd be willing to vet some of your materials and say, like, hey, does this resonate? Does this make sense? It also underscores the importance of working and hiring outreach workers who come from communities. They're not going to be able to represent what will work for every community, or even many people from their own community, but it might be a little bit of a step in the right direction. And does that answer your question?
I think so. Your skis were a good example because I was thinking about, I worked in Germany for a while, and people would make reference, other Americans would make reference to American TV commercials, which of course mean nothing to a German person, you know. So it was kind of
Absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes, and that goes into that cultural, you know, the cultural differences versus just the linguistic. Another thing I'm going to randomly shoot here in here because it set something off for me is Google Translate, machine-based translations. And I think now this is widely understood enough, so maybe I'm just preaching to the choir here, but there's not a tech solution to this. Tech can assist, and there are some tech solutions that will help us kind of get there, but it is absolutely not solving any communication problems yet. Anybody who is bilingual, just take any block of words and plug it into Google Translate and have a good laugh. Because the way that those machine-based translations work is they just comb the internet for references, and then a machine tries to amalgamate them to make some sort of sense. So we haven't done away with the need for humans yet. We still need the humans to serve as interpreters and translators.
Thank you. And then I think Santiago, you had messaged me. It looks like Cynthia had a question or a comment.
I think Anna Marie was before me, no?
I think we saw that.
Yeah, she indicated she does not have a question.
Oh, okay.
Can you stop this? Can you stop the sharing? Stop the sharing.
Sure.
Thanks.
Marissa, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It was like a very comprehensive presentation. I have a question, and maybe we can work offline on, this is the first time I've heard of a comprehensive language access plan. And so what does that plan look like? What does it comprise? And like, how have you utilized it maybe in your line of work?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you, I'll talk about CRLA's language plan. So I'll talk about the before times when we were not using best practices, and then I'll talk about what we've done to really improve. I want to be transparent about that, to not give this appearance that we're doing it perfectly and everyone needs to fall in line. So in the before times, we had a language access plan that was kind of general, and staff didn't really know where to find it. And they were like, I think it's on SharePoint, and we kind of vaguely knew it was in it. And we knew that we had a telephonic interpreter line, and that was kind of it. And then for Indigenous languages, we knew that we had our partner organizations, but our staff weren't really well trained on how, like if they actually needed in the moment, someone was standing in front of them, they were like lost. Like, do I call directly? Do I call Marisa? Do I call somebody else? Like, how do I hire the interpreter? So we've started this major overhaul of our own language practices, and we developed a much more comprehensive policy that assessed the language needs statewide based on existing data sets that capture language ability. Indigenous languages are not captured in any existing demographic scoop up, any formal. So we looked at Rick Mine's study from 2000 to 2008, or I'm sorry, that came out in 2010. We talked to partner organizations. We looked at our own records to see what languages were coming in the door. And then we kind of worked backward from there to see what Indigenous language needs were. From there, we proactively set up contracts, and this is all in our plan. This was all part of the planning process for the plan. We set up agreements with the Indigenous language interpreter agencies, set up contracts so that the process was very quick, so that if somebody did come in, we had the process already set out about how to hire an interpreter. We also have a network of interpreters we work with in Mexico for languages that we're not able to match domestically. And we do that pretty regularly. And sometimes people act like that's like going to the moon to find an interpreter. And these days with Zoom and all the technology, it's really not that big of a deal. The hardest part is your finance department will have to wrap their mind around sending money to Mexico, and they're going to be like, I don't know about that. And you just have to assure them that we're a global society now, and it's okay to send some money to Mexico to pay for a legitimate service. So we identify a protocol for how to identify language need. We identified a protocol for when to use an interpreter, because sometimes if it's just a few words and the client speaks a few words of Spanish, can you set up the meeting? Like, we try to resolve some of those internal conflicts. And then the most important thing is we are just aggressively telling our staff it's okay to incur these expenses. because we're a nonprofit, and I'm sure like all agencies that are resource challenged, you're so used to being like, save that paper clip, turn off the lights, and doing everything you can to save money. And so some staff with very good intentions think they're saving your agency or organization money by not incurring the cost. And you have to say, look, this is the cost of doing business. It is okay to hire it. That is more important than saving the money and proceeding in a language that the client or the individual doesn't speak. And then we regularly train staff on the contents of the plan. We have it on ready access now. I look at it all the time. It's where we think out any possible impediment. It's a really silly one, but you know, one of the biggest barriers for us, for people to use telephonic interpretation is they can't figure out the three-way call function on the phones. Like they're totally all about providing language access, but it's just the fear of using the three-way call function. So it's thinking about everything like that. And then talking about when we need an in-person interpreter versus when telephonic is sufficient, when video interpreting should be used, and going through the different situations when that would be warranted.
Thanks. I have a general question. I don't want to hog up all the time, but is it okay if I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. So this might be a general question, but so one of my takeaways from this presentation, or the three presentations, is that it's important for us to be proactive and to be a forward-facing agency. There's some challenges with being recognized and gaining the trust of certain communities, but one of the ways that I've at least taken away from this is that we need to be more proactive. And so I think a question that arises is, we've heard about WhatsApp and Facebook being very good methods for communication. I'm thinking, if the ALRB wanted perhaps to host like a instructional video on their website, would that be effective communication, or is it too far off for us to think, well, if folks don't really recognize our entity, are they going to go on our website, right? And so I think effective methods of communication, given the challenges that we've identified today, how any suggestions on how to be a little bit more proactive in a way that's going to be outcome, that's gonna result in some positive outcomes, I think, generally speaking, right?
Sure. First is, I think it's helpful to kind of have a plan in place for how to receive the community members you're conducting outreach towards. Because I'm seeing a big push with some agencies who are trying to produce outreach materials in various indigenous languages, and then they don't have any plan for how to receive people once they come in the door. So I think I just want to make sure you're not shooting yourself in the foot by getting people in with a false expectation that they will have language services, and then they don't get them once they come in. Indigenous language radio has been very successful for us. We have and I mean, we're trying to build our own visibility with like a YouTube channel. I think YouTube is widely used, and it's just kind of a matter of getting that linked to the right community leader or organization. I think that if you build relationships with an organization like MyCop or CBDIO, and they can they can emphasize, they can elevate, can't think of all the right words always with social media, retweet, bring up the link or whatever, then on their platforms, then you can kind of plug into those social networks. We are very lucky. I mean, the members that we have on staff, like we have people who are very well respected in their communities. So if they, post a Facebook video on their personal Facebook page, it's going to get a lot of hits because of their network is very large. So I think it's kind of tapping into existing networks. So you can store it on your web page, but I think having like a YouTube channel and looking for other partners to say, hey, can you put this link on your site would be a good way to elevate that.
Thank you. I also think, Chris, I believe you had a comment, or were in the queue as well.
Yes, thank you. And great presentation. One thing that you said at the end that I think really is important to emphasize, you said a good experience goes a long way, so does a bad one. But I would sort of rephrase that. The good experience goes a long way. A bad one goes a whole lot further. If we go someplace for service and we have a bad experience, we tell 10 people about it. If we have a good experience, we're probably not going to tell anyone. And we have to keep that in mind as we serve the community, that if someone comes from a new community to us and they have a bad experience, that's not going to impact just that person. It's going to have implications throughout the community. So thank you.
I think it's a great point. And the way that we think about the expenditure of resources on this is like, I might take a case that we should probably refer out. And my thought is, okay, I can do this case in 5 hours and that's going to save me 15 hours in outreach to this community. So you really have to be dynamic in your thinking of cost, and you have to remember it. And you can't just think of it as a line by line. The same thing with investing and interpreting. It pays off dividends. It really does. But it's one of those things that people, if you're used to just looking line by line in expenditures and you go, well, that's larger than what we paid in the past, so it's too much. And you have to just look at your budget a little bit more holistically.
Thank you. I'd like to open up if there's any other public comment. Doesn't look like there's anyone else in the queue. Any other questions or comments from our board members or staff? Okay, I want to thank again all of our panelists today, Gaspar, Rick, and Marissa. It was wonderful. I think I learned a lot. I really appreciate the thoroughness of your presentations. I anticipate that myself and others on our staff will likely be reaching out to you for some feedback. I think the focus of our time right now is really about enhancing the way that we communicate, the way making sure that we are accessible in a very holistic sense of that word. And so really appreciate the information that you shared with us today. I think it'll be really helpful in a number of future endeavors that we have at the ALRB. It was very interesting as well. Moving on to our last.
Can I get a copy? Marissa, do you mind if I get a copy of your presentation as well?
Yeah, it should all be in the, right, Cynthia? I think they'll be all in the meeting materials, and we have them in English and Spanish.
Perfect.
Right.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll move on to our final agenda item, which is announcements. And just to let everyone know, we do have in about an hour at 2 o'clock our regional directors meeting. There is a separate agenda and dial-in information for that, again, on our website, listed under the news and information tab, as well as under our meetings tab under public notices and agendas. So that's the regional directors meeting at 2. We will not have a public board meeting in November, but we will have our last meeting of the year in early December. That date is to be determined, but that will be posted by around mid-November. Additionally, at that meeting, we will be having our pre-rulemaking and discussing where we are in our regulatory review process. So really welcome any and all feedback, and we hope to engage with our stakeholders there about ways that we can improve the regulations and make them easier to use. And so I just want to thank everyone for their participation today and look forward to seeing everyone in about an hour at the regional directors meeting. With that, this meeting of the ALRB is adjourned.